Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is the program on constitutional government's biennial election analysis. I think there's been a bit of surprise for this one, so I'll ask you to dry your tears and think, listen, analyze, ask, speak. We've always boasted that this is the only such event with both left and right represented. Bill Galston on the left and Bill Kristol on the right. But now Bill Kristol is moved over to the left, leaving a vacuum. So Ross Douthat is going to fill the vacuum. Of course, he's free to speak as he pleases. I'm here in case of a mistake. Now, why did Bill Kristol move to the left?
That's the right question.
A good topic for an hour.
2 words. I'll do it in 2 words. Donald Trump. The Donald, he says, or used to say, objectifying the name. And that's another difference from the usual election analysis. We here actually use proper names. Most political science is science. And science is quantitative. It uses numbers and avoids names. Names you find in the humanities. Numbers you find in science. MIT buildings have numbers, not names. Science tends to ignore proper nouns. Hence, science can be objective, above politics insofar as it pits Mr. Trump against MS Harris. Politics for science is the voting behavior of numbers, not the character of the candidates. Political science is like economics. It likes preferences and data. Doesn't care about making America great again, slogans, ideas. It surveys opinions but doesn't judge them. Instead of saying something is important, political science says it is non-trivial. Here we are at Harvard. Is Harvard objective above politics? What is the character of this meeting? If the speakers are objective, we don't need different perspectives of right and left. Every contributor is detached, independent. This means Harvard is an ivory tower. We don't need perspectives because we're far above the differences that individuals might make. Hence, we don't need both right and left at Harvard. One of them is good enough because neither makes any difference. Therefore, Harvard is like the District of Columbia. On Tuesday, 92% of the voters in the District of Columbia went for Kamala Harris. This was quite different from the rest of the country, which I hesitate to inform you, went for Donald Trump. But there's no problem. Everybody knows that the District of Columbia operates for the common good of the whole nation, regardless of its partisan voting. So it's just the same with Harvard, which also votes 92% for Harris. But this doesn't affect its academic integrity or taint its political science. Yet, a recent president of Harvard, in her initial announcement, said that she was abandoning the ivory tower for the principle that Harvard was a part of society, not a tower above it. Republicans in Congress, however, led by the much maligned Representative Elise Stefanik, said to be vile, I've heard this about her, used her prosecutorial skills, perhaps learned by watching Senator Kamala Harris, to attack and confuse our president. Back at Harvard, many of our faculty defended the president against the unjust treatment of outsiders, Republicans, in Washington. Outsiders, be it noted. Harvard is independent of the society whose center is Washington. However much it resembles Washington in its voting behavior. So which is it? Is Harvard an ivory tower, or is it a part of society? Which characterizes this meeting? If it's an ivory tower, it's devoted only to objectivity. Harvard can forget Donald Trump and his minions, even if he is the most notable or noticeable individual in the world today. If Harvard is a part of society, it must take sides and not complain of the wickedness of an animal that defends itself when it's attacked. A dilemma. But note that an ivory tower is not a cloud above society or a Chinese spy balloon. An ivory tower has its foundation in a particular society to which it cannot be indifferent. Aristotle has the answer. You didn't think that you were going to come to an event on the program on constitutional government and not hear about Aristotle. Aristotle did not mention the ivory tower. That's something medieval. Actually, universities were the invention of the Middle Ages. But he said this. He said, a political scientist is like a doctor who has himself for a patient. The doctor, that's scientific objectivity. Himself as a patient cannot be indifferent to your own body. Well, I've used up the time allotted for an introduction for speakers. You can Google them. Which is more valuable, Widener Library or Google? But I will identify them. Ross Douthat is going to go first. Is a columnist at the New York Times. He went to Harvard. He never wasted a moment of his life in graduate school. He's the author of The Deep Places, which, by the way, is not about a doctor who has himself for a patient, but a patient who has himself for a doctor. The Decadent Society, and forthcoming a book entitled Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious. And then Bill Galston, senior fellow at Brookings, author of many books on liberalism, also on Aristotle and liberalism, and Kant. I always like to mention his first book, Kant and the Problem of History. He went to Cornell, where he stayed in a fraternity for smart people, and then to Chicago for his PhD. And last, Bill Kristol, founder of Bulwark, publisher of the late lamented Weekly Standard, many other jobs. He went to Harvard and he got his PhD at Harvard. So that's our lineup. Our program is to listen to each of us, each of the three, for a while, then let them interchange, then questions from the audience, and at 6 o'clock, we've got a supper for you outside. After supper, about 7, we'll have some more questions so that everybody can get his question answered. So Ross, how about you?
Thank you, Professor. Having not gone to graduate school, I don't think I have the standing to address you in a more familiar fashion. It's a privilege to be here. It's a privilege to fill Bill's mighty 7-league boots as, you know, the representative of reactionary forces in this conversation. So I guess our duty is to try and describe to you what we think happened not last. It's been a long 48 hours, but it's only been 48 hours, so 2 days ago, and maybe say something about what might come next, something encouraging, something discouraging, we'll see. I'm trying to adopt a Mansfieldian register as I go. So I'll start with what happened. One of the things you quickly realize when you become a New York Times columnist is that for many people, the only purpose of a New York Times columnist, or the only purpose of knowing one, being in conversation with one, buttonholing one over drinks, is to find out who's going to win the next election. That is, I would say, people say, what kind of questions do strangers, friends, acquaintances ask you when you're a New York Times columnist? 87% of the questions are about who's going to win the next election. 10% are about how much they like David Brooks. There isn't even a question. They just talk. And then there's another 3% about whether the columnists hang out in a clubhouse or something. So I started as a Times columnist, I guess, during Barack Obama's first term. And in that period, almost every time when people have asked me what's going to happen in this election, I have tended to give them the wrong answer. When it was 2012 and Mitt Romney versus Barack Obama, I either told them that I thought Romney had a good chance to win, or that it was going to be, you know, a late night, drawn out 50-50 Florida in 2000 style battle. And in the event, Barack Obama won the election pretty easily. In 2016, I think I gave Trump, you know, a slightly higher chance than the luckless Princeton academic who promised to like eat his hat on live TV if Trump won. You know, I gave him like a 10 or 15% chance, but I told people Hillary Clinton was going to win for sure. She did not, as you may recall. In 2020, I got closer. I did tell people that Joe Biden was going to win, and he did, but not by the margin at all that I expected. And there was a very discomforting for a pundit 2-hour period on election night when it seemed like 2016 was happening all over again. So I expected something close to a landslide, and we got a clear popular vote victory, but a real nail-biter in the Electoral College. So this time around, I've finally done it. I have succeeded in consistently and accurately telling people for the last 6 to 9 months who I thought was going to win the election. People would say, you know, who's going to win? And I'd say Trump. And they would sort of stare at me and wait for me to say something else, to qualify it, to sort of walk it back, and I would just say Trump. I had this conversation with my wife, basically like every 3 weeks, and she'd be like, are you sure? And I'd say, I'm pretty sure. And I was right. So whatever else it means for the country, I think it means I'm finally ready to retire from this particular line of work. I've figured it out. So why did I think Trump was going to win? Well, because I think there is a pretty simple story to tell about the 2024 election, which I'll try to tell for you right now, and then add some other commentary. Here's the story. 4 years ago, Joseph Robinette Biden was elected president of the United States in the midst of a once-in-a-century pandemic, a period of disease, chaos, protest, online mediated derangement, much, though not all of it, driven by the then president, Donald Trump. And Biden's central promise, he had other promises, obviously, but his central promise was to restore normalcy, to, if not catapult the United States back in time to, the world before Donald Trump came on the scene, at the very least, bring a sense of stability, order, and, sort of a sense of sort of moderate improvement in conditions to an America that was, in pretty bad shape at the time of the last election. And in all kinds of ways, large and small, his administration failed to deliver on that promise. And when administrations fail to deliver on their promises, they almost always lose the next election. So let me walk you through some examples. To begin with, Biden promised to be a much steadier, more experienced hand in foreign policy than Donald Trump. And yet, the 4 years of the Biden administration have seen a withdrawal from Afghanistan that even those who thought we should get out of Afghanistan, myself included, had to concede was utterly catastrophic. They have seen the most significant land war and cross-border invasion in the European continent since the Second World War. They have seen the most significant attack on the Jewish state in a very long time, succeeded by a bloody and punishing war in the Holy Land and related territories. They have seen, more broadly, some sort of, saber rattling and moves in sort of a aggressive direction by the People's Republic of China around Taiwan. And generally, they have witnessed a world or observed a world in which the Pax Americana, the American-led liberal international order, whatever kind of political science terminology you want to apply to it, the American position in the world is more pressured, more strained, more stretched, and just in a more dangerous condition than it was at any point in the Trump presidency, with, up to and including, the shadow of some kind of nuclear exchange with Vladimir Putin's Russia, which is something that sort of gets enfolded now and then into stories about the first year of the Ukraine war, where you'll see a piece in the Washington Post where someone says, oh, and U.S. analysts thought there was a 50% chance that if certain things went sideways, Putin would use nukes. And you're like, oh, well, I mean, that's again, a sort of, that gets enfolded into footnotes in Washington Post stories, I think tells you something significant about how abnormal, from the point of view of, let's just say, the typical American voter who is certainly not a foreign policy expert, from their perspective, how abnormal the last 4 years have been. In economics, the Biden administration, without having necessarily campaigned on a sweeping New Deal style agenda, became very excited about the possibility of such a transformative agenda in its first months in office, pushed through some very substantial spending bills, and reaped, again, without this being entirely the fault of the spending bills, inflation is a global phenomenon, nonetheless, reaped the most substantial inflation that Americans have experienced since the twilight of Jimmy Carter's presidency and the first years of Ronald Reagan, when I was 1 year old. Voters hate inflation. How much they hate it had sort of slipped out of the minds of pundits and politicians, again, myself included. I'm not going to tell you that I wrote a lot of columns warning that inflation was about to, transform American politics, because in my entire professional career, inflation had never transformed American politics. I only had history books to go on. But voters really, really hate inflation, and they hate it in a way that cannot simply be compensated for by a lower unemployment rate and other indicators of economic health. They hate inflation even when the overall rate of inflation begins to go down. They continue to hate it until some period of stability is reached, followed by some kind of period of actual real wage increases. And we may have entered such a period over depending on how you slice the data over the last 6 months to 15 months. But it is not at all surprising that the shadow of that, again, first time in 40 years, major bout of inflation would make people feel like the Biden administration had not kept its promise of restoring normalcy. From the point of view of any American born after 1970, no economic conditions had been so abnormal, save, in the aftermath of the Great Recession or something like that. So you have abnormality in foreign policy. You have abnormality in economics. Then, and this is a little more complex, and sort of subject, I think, to a bit more debate. But I think the period of the Biden administration, having Donald Trump off the stage to some extent, having the particular crisis of the pandemic, the fear of death associated with it, the actual deaths associated with it, having that sort of sense of emergency recede led to a greater reckoning than had been possible in the election of 2020 with some of the ideas that had been embraced as normative and enforced with semi-McCarthyite fervor by a broad swath of the American liberal, I said illiberal, nice Freudian slip there, the American liberal elite. I suspect for people in this room, denizens of Harvard University, members of that elite, I don't necessarily have to bore you by recapitulating all of these ideas. I would just submit, sort of in anticipation of comments perhaps by the gentleman to my right, that this period of sort of left-wing ideological fervor was not simply something reducible to a matter of, we held too many sort of, diversity training sessions where people had to read bad books by Ibram Kendi. That was not the substance of what people actually experienced. What people actually experienced was the temporary but dramatic depolicing of American cities. Yes, the police were not defunded, but the police did withdraw. They experienced an atmosphere of sort of stifling intellectual conformity in which dissenters feared for their professions, their livelihoods, and their jobs across a very wide range of American professions, not limited to opinion pages of major newspapers and academic institutions. They experienced a fairly substantial social transformation in the lives of their children, particularly the lives of their teenage girls, particularly around issues related to gender identity and potential treatments for gender dysphoria, in which the possibility, not just that your child would come home and announce that they were a different gender from what had been assigned to them at birth, but also the possibility that the leading institutions of American life would encourage them to immediately embark on unproven medical treatments with a possible surgical destination as the only possible method of avoiding suicidality. That possibility, again, hung over many more people than just a few inhabitants of the most left-wing spaces in American life. Anyway, I could go on, but I'll stop. I think that suffices to make the point that this was a pretty wild and crazy ideological period in American life that, again, I think was sort of reckoned with fairly gradually over the course of the Biden administration in ways that, again, did not necessarily make Biden personally seem less normal than he had promised to be, but certainly made the coalition that he led and the institutions that it was associated with seem pretty abnormal indeed. And then finally we come to Biden himself, because over the same period in which all of these abnormalities were either being experienced or being reckoned with, America also had to deal with a consistent conspiracy against the public good carried out by the officials of the Biden White House to conceal from the country the manifest deterioration of the chief executive of the United States, a situation really without parallel unless you count the darkest days of Watergate going back to the period when Edith Wilson was acting president of the United States. A fairly unusual, distinctly abnormal period of time, I would say. And this conspiracy against the public interest was nearly carried out through the entirety of the 2024 presidential election. Had Joe Biden had a slightly better night at the first presidential debate, we might be having a conversation about how he had lost to Donald Trump, as I think he would have, rather than Kamala Harris, notwithstanding his various incapacities and various limits on his ability to perform the office of the presidency. So I think that was pretty abnormal too. Now, to their great credit, the leaders of the Democratic Party, when it was forced upon them by that debate performance, did manage to remove Joe Biden from the Democratic ticket and ran in his stead Kamala Harris, a machine politician from the most liberal state in the country who had never before had any need to compete for any voter with a politics anywhere to the left of, let's say, Bill Galston or Amy Klobuchar, maybe, or something like that. I think we'll go back and forth on, given her own limitations and the admittedly extremely difficult situation she was placed into, just what kind of a job Kamala Harris did. But I think the attempt by the institutions of American liberalism to make her candidacy happen, if you will, was itself a kind of highly abnormal episode in American political life. I'm going to give into temptation and read a brief description of this from a very long and at times inappropriate post-election summary written by a sort of louche, dissolute, left-wing British journalist named Sam Criss. This is just one paragraph. I really recommend the whole piece. But he says, this is written, I assume, 48 hours ago, "Do you remember Brat Summer? I remember Brat Summer. It was genuinely amazing, one of the most bizarre mass psychological phenomena I've ever seen. Before a clock spring popped out of Joe Biden's forehead on live TV, Kamala Harris was the least popular vice president in recent U.S. history. There were a lot of reasons for this, but I think the big ones are these. First, she was already deeply unpopular. 0% primary polls, remember, before she became VP. Secondly, she'd done absolutely nothing with the position except emit strange and incomprehensible bromides whenever she opened her mouth. But as soon as she became the candidate, despite nothing about her actually changing, her approval rating skyrocketed. It turns out that all you have to do is tell the Democratic base that they ought to like someone, and they'll just start liking her. I think this is evidence of an extraordinary generosity of spirit. All of us, me especially, could learn something from them, but it was incredible to watch. All these politicians and pundits who had been so stiff and serious in the gloom of the Biden era suddenly breaking out in virulent lime green, like a new tropical disease ripping through the establishment. Doughy old columnists transformed overnight into 13-year-old girls in shiny lip gloss. Somehow this career politician, born when parts of Africa still belonged to the British Empire, turned overnight into some sort of snotty e-girl. The New York Times printed the words coconut-pilled. Sure, it was all vibes, but the vibes were good. Wasn't it fun now that old man Biden was gone and you could, etc. Some inappropriate stuff. But for some unaccountable reason, among the general public, Kamala, you already like her, was not the brilliant pitch it seemed to be. I think that that's an accurate, if pungent and maybe over-the-top distillation of the weirdness of the moment when a lot of people in my profession convinced themselves that Kamala Harris was about to become president of the United States. And I think it's a good place to end my account of the ways in which abnormalcy has been a defining feature of a Biden administration that promised normalcy. And set against that, very briefly, we can save the future for the back and forth, but set against that, you had Donald Trump, who was a familiar figure at this point to Americans, someone who had already been president for 4 years, someone whose greatest vices were in some sense sort of baked into public perceptions of him, and against whom I would say 2 arguments were made. The first one, which my own editorial board made in its final thing, was that you had to take him really seriously, that he was once again saying things, the kind of things he said as president, kind of things he'd said as a candidate in 2016, saying things about his enemies, about what he intended to do, that were, crazy, dangerous, fascistic, whatever other epithet you choose. And that was the reality. Donald Trump in 2024, as in 2020, as in 2016, as, God help us until he's, departs the political scene, said a lot of wild and deplorable things over the course of the 2024 election. But having lived through the first Trump administration, in which there was a huge disconnect between Trumpian rhetoric and the actual realities of governance, I don't think it was that surprising that the voting public was inclined to join with, frankly, many of Trump's elite supporters. Because the other interesting thing that happened in this election cycle was that, unlike in 2020, a mostly Silicon Valley-based segment of the American elite actually sort of broke off and publicly supported Trump. And voters and those elites joined together in telling themselves that if we went through this for 4 years and things were okay, and Donald Trump did not become a fascist dictator, we can go through it for 4 more years, given that the alternative is continuing abnormality in the Biden-Harris style. That left the final argument, which was that, in fact, Donald Trump did do something legitimately terrible in trying to overturn the result of the 2020 election, that after that moment, you had to take him seriously because he had gone all the way to trying to foment a constitutional crisis, and that for that reason, that had to be reason enough, that the risk of that abnormality recurring had to trump, if you will, all of the abnormalities of the Biden era. As someone who has never been a Trump supporter, I still find that argument quite compelling. And I think it was, in the end, the argument that tipped the scales in key Senate races in the 2022 midterms. I think, in the end, the force of that argument, as a kind of pull on people, keeping them from supporting Trump, is one reason why the election was as close as it was. Because in the end, it actually was a pretty close election. Everyone's sort of shell-shocked. I'm not shell-shocked, but maybe you're shell-shocked by Trump winning the popular vote. But in the end, he's going to win it probably by less than Obama won in 2012, maybe less than George W. Bush won in 2004. This was not a landslide election. Was, electorally, in the Electoral College, maybe, but even then, it was nothing compared to, the salad days of Ronald Reagan or Richard Nixon, right? So the election was close, I think, for various reasons, but in part just because there was force enough in that argument to keep it close. But there wasn't force enough in that argument to overcome the broader picture that I've tried to paint here, and that's why we are where we find ourselves today. Thank you.
Well, these are uncertain times that we live in, but I'm happy to report that this convocation is a bastion of stability. With a few deviations forced on Harvey by necessity, political necessity, we have convened this cast since 1992, which, if the old math serves me, was 32 years ago. We were young and gay, no longer. To Harvey, as always, thank you. And your introduction proves that in an ever-changing world, at least one thing never changes. And I hope it never does. Although I have to say, I was surprised but not entirely shocked that you could not get through your introduction without mentioning Aristotle, which is good, but I have to wonder why Machiavelli was conspicuous by his omission. Do we learn more from the omission than we do from the overt words? Details.
Right about that.
Yes. And as for Ross, I'm not going to start by crossing swords with you, but I will say I am shocked that a New York Times columnist would mainstream a word created by Warren G. Harding without any dictionary support whatsoever. I thought you stood for standards. This is a sad decline. So, on with the show. I'm reliably informed, as the only non-Harvard person on this panel, I have to rely on hearsay. And I've heard it said that Harvard, whatever its other vices may be, is a pretty high-toned place. And for that reason, and also given my assumed position in the ideological spectrum on this panel, I have decided to begin with a quotation from Karl Marx, a famous quotation. Marx said in the 18th Brumaire, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances given by and transmitted from the past. This is the father, or perhaps the grandfather, of the familiar sociological distinction between structure and agency. Which is a high-toned way of asking the following political question. Namely, how much freedom of action did Harris actually have as she thought through her campaign, and how much was dictated and constrained by the circumstances in which she found herself? She announced at the beginning of her campaign that she was the underdog. And I believe that political judgment was correct for many of the reasons that Ross stated, which I will now translate into my own terms. In the form of an imaginative counterhistory. My argument is that Harris's choices were dictated not only by large, long-cycle historical changes in the American party system, and we'll get to that at the end, but also by choices that the man who elevated her to the vice presidency made. There were 4 key Biden choices that dictated, I believe, the terms of the 2024 presidential election. And once I lay them out, I will invite you to ask yourselves, how different would the story of Tuesday's election have been, if at all, if Joe Biden had made different choices? So what are these choices? Let me begin with 3 of them. First of all, largely in reaction to the memory of Obama staffers, who then went on to serve in Joe Biden's administration, that there was not enough government stimulus to combat the consequences of the financial collapse of 2007, 2008, Joe Biden decided to add $2 trillion of stimulus over a very short period of time to an economy that was unfreezing from the pandemic shutdown, but was not yet fully recovered. It was substantially recovered. Unemployment peaked at 14.5% at the height of the pandemic. By the time Joe Biden took office, it was already down to 6.5% and still heading down. But the Biden people were afraid that, well, it might stabilize at that level or somewhere near it, giving rise to the kind of painfully slow recovery that we saw throughout almost all of the Biden administration. For reasons rooted in the recent intellectual history of the discussion on the left, The Biden economists persuaded themselves that they could add $2 trillion of stimulus without risking a dangerous spike in inflation. They were wrong, with all of the political consequences that Ross laid out. Second, immigration. Candidate Joe Biden was critical, and I think appropriately so, of many of the tactics that the Trump administration, or should I say now, the first Trump administration used to shut down the southern border, or at least make it much less permeable than it had been in prior years. And he came into office sworn to do away with the Trump policy. Now, you might imagine that having promised to do away with it, he would put something substantive in its place. Alas, he didn't. And the result was a 3-year spike in illegal border crossings, and transforming it from a border state issue into a national issue, followed by a decision this year by President Biden to institute some real restrictions on border crossings, which had the effect of reducing those crossings by more than 75%. So here's another counterfactual question. What would the 2024 election have been like if Joe Biden had done in 2021 what he did in 2024? The third decision was the exodus from Afghanistan. Now, everybody knows from the inner saga of the Obama administration that Biden had been strongly opposed to our continuing presence in Afghanistan from the very beginning of the Obama administration, and had privately counseled President Obama on many occasions to cut his losses. And it became clear that Biden wanted to get out of Afghanistan in the worst way. And when he became president, he found that worst way. And now, the result, the political consequence of these three decisions was that a president who came into office on a wave of popularity and goodwill, whose job approval was north of 55% in April and May of 2021, by September had fallen into the low 40s, a level from which it never recovered. Once he had fallen, he never came back. So Kamala Harris was given the role of running as the faithful vice president to a president who was as unpopular at the beginning of his 4th year in office as nearly any other, more unpopular than nearly any other in modern history. Did it have to be that way? Here we get to Biden's 4th decision. And that decision was, to break what seemed to be a promise to be a transitional president, that is to say, a one-term president, and run for re-election. That was a fateful decision for all sorts of reasons. But let me focus on just one of them. By making that decision and not reversing it until July 20th of this year, President Biden ruled out the possibility that there could be a competitive Democratic primary. In fact, there was no Democratic primary. And I think this worked greatly to Kamala Harris's disadvantage. She had no chance to lay out her agenda, to have it sharpened in debate, and to learn as primary contests, and I've been in campaigns with lots of primary contests, no chance to sharpen either the substance or the presentation of the agenda. She had to learn how to do that on the fly, while also on the fly constructing the apparatus of a presidential campaign. Second, she had no chance really to introduce herself to the American people. If you are vice president, you are supposed to be in the shadows. You are supposed to be inconspicuous. You are not supposed to have an identity that's independent from the president's identity, which is why in the best of circumstances, it's so hard for vice presidents to succeed their president through election as opposed to death or disability. Which brings me to the third and related point. Without a primary, she had no chance to establish an independent identity. She was fated at that point to run as Joe Biden's vice president. Now, this raises the obvious question. Once she assumed the nomination under those circumstances, was she doomed? Was the outcome that Ross described inevitable? It's really in part impossible to know for sure, and I'm not going to pretend that I do. What I do know is that she made some choices during her campaign that did not improve her situation and indeed may have made it worse. I could go on for a long time in this vein, but let me just touch on 2 points. First of all, she had a theory of the case. That theory went that focusing on reproductive choice would mobilize an army of concerned women and send them to the polls. If you're interested, I will lay out the numbers demonstrating that that strategy did not work at all. She believed, second, that she could successfully contrast her decency to Donald Trump's, in some real sense, indecency, that would work in her favor. Not only that contrast would work in her favor, but it actually moved votes from him to her, or from undecided to her, or from unmotivated to her. That didn't work either. And finally, this was her closing argument, which came around full circle from the politics of joy to son of Joe Biden, or daughter of Joe Biden, Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. Now, I happen to believe that there's a lot of substance to that argument, but here's the problem. There is a mountain of political science evidence to the effect that for people who feel hard-pressed economically or insecure physically, democracy is a luxury good. It's something, it's an argument. It's not that they don't care about democracy, but as Bertolt Brecht, continuing my role, once put it, grub first, then democracy. And that, I'm afraid that for the voters she was trying to move, that turned out to be the truth of the matter. They did not disagree with her arguments about democracy, but they did not give it the kind of priority that it would have to have had in their motivational structure in order to get them to respond to it in large numbers. So the theory of the case was not implausible on paper, but it turned out to be wrong in all relevant respects. Then she made 2 tactical decisions that I think further weakened her prospects. First of all, she did not separate herself from Joe Biden. And when given an opportunity to do so in full view of the nation, she conspicuously refrained from doing so. And she never really tried to go back and give a different and better answer to the question of, in what respects would you have differed at all with what Joe Biden has done during his 4 years? And I suppose the argument internally was that you'll make enemies out of your friends without making friends out of your enemies. Maybe so, but I am old enough to remember that Hubert Humphrey in 1968 was given up for political death until he broke cleanly with Lyndon Johnson about the Vietnam War, and that was almost enough to propel him to a come-from-behind victory over Richard Nixon. Could she have done anything as dramatic as that this year? I don't know, but what I do know is she didn't try. Equally fatefully, not only did she not separate herself from Joe Biden, she didn't separate herself from her own past. Given opportunity after opportunity to explain why she had abandoned the positions that were the centerpieces of her abortive 2019 run for the Democratic presidential nomination, so abortive that she didn't even get to 2020 before leaving the race, she refused to explain the shift. And she said, I'm sure truthfully, well, my values haven't changed, which was, true, but as the lawyers would say, unresponsive to the actual question. Donald Trump, by contrast, had a theory of the case that turned out to be right. And what was that theory? Well, that a combination of a focus on inflation in the economy and immigration would move people to his side, and that his pugnacity would not be held against him, but would indeed appeal to a lot of otherwise hard-to-reach voters, especially young voters of the male variety. He also made some tactical decisions that turned out to be correct. First of all, that he could do everything he could to mobilize his base rather than reaching out to the disappointed minority of the Republican Party and not pay a price for it. And he turned out to be dead right. Despite the Nikki Haley insurgency that lasted longer than the Haley candidacy did, he got 95% of the Republican vote. There was no evidence of a split within the Republican Party. And secondly, and to my mind even more amazingly, after a vigorous debate inside the Trump campaign, which was chronicled very nicely by the New York Times, I think this morning, he decided that despite having been responsible for the appointment of the 3 Supreme Court justices who overturned Roe v. Wade, that he would not campaign in favor of a national abortion ban, but rather campaign on the basis of leaving it to the states. And then when that seemed not to be enough, he was persuaded to publicly announce that if a national abortion ban came to his desk, he would veto it. And those two decisions, I believe, had the effect of muting, if not mooting, the effect of the abortion issue on the Trump candidacy. There's a lot else I could say, but let me just end with two broader considerations. Ross writes a weekly column for the New York Times. I write a weekly column for the Wall Street Journal. In both cases, I believe we were selected as minority, if not dissenting voices. In one of my columns before the election, I posed the following question, which I viewed as crucial to the success of the Trump candidacy. Could he expand the Republican Party beyond its base in the white working class in the direction of becoming a multi-ethnic working class party? And the answer to that question is yes. He was able to move the Republican Party substantially in that direction. That was not something he invented. It was a continuation of a trend that began well before he appeared on the scene. If you're interested, we can go into some details. But that was a huge success. In 2020, he improved his standing among Hispanic voters by 10 full percentage points, and he improved it by another 6 points in this election. And if the exit polls are to be believed, he got 44% of the Hispanic vote and a clear majority of the Hispanic male vote. For all sorts of historical reasons, the African American community was more resistant to that change. But I note that his share of the African American male vote increased from 8% to 20% between 2020 and 2024. This leads me to the following concluding reflection, which is framed by my college and graduate school years. There was, back in the days of yore, the holy trinity of race, gender, and class that were supposed to be the major determinants of culture and politics. And we saw something very interesting this year, and that is that that class and gender trumped race and ethnicity. And when it came to a showdown between class and gender, class trumped gender. White working class women their pattern was much closer to that of white working class men than it was to white college educated women. That went for the abortion issue as well as a bunch of others. I believe that we're in a new political era in which class will be the dominant factor in political divisions. Class as defined not only or even principally by income, but class as defined by educational attainment. And I think we, and the American democracy is not unique in this regard, will be wrestling with a split between people with high levels of education and people with lower levels of education for the next generation, with consequences that I can't begin to predict. Thank you very much.
I've got to say, I'm very disappointed by these two talks, neither of which addressed the crucial question that Harvey raised at the beginning, which is, why did Bill Kristol move left? Instead, we had all this talk about Harris and Biden, tiny bit about Trump. I noticed that a little less about Trump somehow. He's like a bit player here, whereas we have to obsess about Brat Summer, whatever that was, which I don't believe moved many votes. Kamala Harris did speak at the Democratic Convention to tens of millions of people, and she gave a substantive speech, which you can judge whether that's crazy, abnormal leftism or much more standard, Hubert Humphrey to use that term, and Clinton and even Obama, liberalism. She did do a debate. There was a debate between the two presidential candidates that everyone has memory hold, where you got a real sense of those two people. There they were, 90 minutes on stage, no notes. I don't know, maybe that, did she seem abnormal then? She seemed pretty effective and impressive to me then, and pretty moderate on the issues I care about. But I agree that the American public didn't agree with me, most of the American public, and that's a fact. That doesn't mean that one side is right and one side is wrong, any more than Harvard's not always right and Harvard's not always wrong. Elites aren't always wrong. I'll shock you to see that for me to have this slightly Aristotelian point of view, that the public can be wrong or the elites can be wrong, and one has to judge on the merits, and one doesn't get to just say, oh, those elites, they're out of touch, and that's the end of the argument. Maybe those elites care a little bit more about, I don't know, demonizing Haitian immigrants in Ohio on the stage of that presidential debate, lying about them, and basically making, let's not kid ourselves, a racist argument to try to appeal to people to be terrified of these Haitians who were doing nothing but working in Middlefield, Ohio. But oh no, that's just, they're Trump's awkward, slightly impolite way of raising legitimate concerns, I suppose, about the temporary protected status of 30,000 Haitians who had been invited into that community, who were living there fine, who the Republican governor of Ohio thought were doing fine, et cetera. So a lot of that can be, as everyone does on each side. I would do it on, I suppose, the side I'm now on. One covers over some of the things one doesn't like, one minimizes them, one minimizes DEI programs at Harvard, one minimizes the kind of ridiculous fact that I guess a few classes were canceled here Wednesday for the well-being of students. I do think maybe that goes a little bit far. I told Ross that coming back to Harvard, I felt like my inner reactionary was being restocked, revivified a little bit, and so I need to come back here more often, I suppose, to remind myself of all the problems I have with the left and with the woke left, which I do have. But I'll just, on the Bill Kristol question, just to end that fascinating topic here, I have no apologies for being, there are two parties in America, two sides really at this point. No apologies for being in the party of Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and Kamala Harris against the party that 3 times has nominated Donald Trump, and with increasing, and after everything we went through, still wants to tell itself that it's just talk or it's a little impolite or unpleasant, and we're not going to really, I'll come back to this a little later, worry too much about what happened. We'll worry a little bit about what might happen as president, but it's outweighed by inflation, which has now receded, and we now have the strongest economy post-pandemic in the world. It's outweighed by mistakes, which I very much also deplore in Afghanistan and elsewhere, but it's outweighed by a war going on in Europe, which the Biden administration has tried to defend the people who are defending themselves against Putin. And we have a Republican ticket that is, in the case of the vice president elect, absolutely on the side of pulling the plug on Ukraine, and Trump is pretty much as well. So I have no apologies. I don't think it's quite fair to say I moved left. I mean, right-left is itself a very modern idea. It's only a couple of centuries. It's not Aristotelian, I don't think, Why don't I get just to say that I moved up from conservatism? Bill Buckley wrote a famous, I mentioned this in case people here are not aware of the complete oeuvre of Bill Buckley, which I once knew a fair amount about as a conservative. One of his earliest books was called it doesn't stand up very well, honestly, if you read it, but it was called Up From Liberalism. And so I'm on the up from conservatism side. It had its good aspects, the American conservative movement. It had become ossified. Ross wrote eloquently about this, actually, in the 2000s. And then it became accommodating of an authoritarian demagogue. Whereas at least American liberalism, for all of its excessive accommodations to some silliness on the left and some dangerous aspects on the left, nominated the more moderate candidates in 2016 and 2020 when there were actually contests, and in 2024, took the vice president of the president who had won in 2020. Wouldn't have been. I was in favor of Biden not running for a second term. I was in favor of a contest even when he got out very late. That didn't happen. I think it might have been better if it had, but anyway, no apologies. But final point, while we're on this fascinating topic, liberalism is kind of worth defending. It would be better if the Democrats defended it better. This is something Harvey wrote about 40, 50 years ago, and has been a consistent theme, and I think we need a much stronger defense of liberalism from liberals. At least liberals sort of want to defend liberalism, to be fair, whereas we now have a conservative party that much of which does not want to defend, in my view, liberal democracy or the core principles of liberalism. So it'd be better if we had two parties that were strong defenders of different aspects of liberalism, but better to have one party that at least is trying to defend it. And in the case of Harris, went pretty far to the center to try to put herself in the mainstream of the broad liberal tradition, not just of the left liberal tradition. A lot of pretty impressive people were liberals in the last couple hundred years. Burke was a Whig, not a Tory, as Harvey well knows. Tocqueville called himself a liberal, sat on the liberal side, even on the left side of the French National Assembly, I believe. Shocking, and called himself a new kind of liberal. That was his phrase, I think. A different kind of liberal, I can't remember. But so, yes, he saw the problems with certain aspects of liberalism. Churchill, the greatest statesman of the 20th century, in my view, was a liberal, then was a conservative, then a liberal, then a conservative, so a little complicated. There's a great story about Churchill, which
great inspiration to you, bro.
He is, believe me. Do I get to cross the aisle one more time is the question. And of course, his most bitter fights were with the great conservative party of his generation. The Tory party, the greatest conservative party in the world in the 30s. How was that leadership? And they hated Churchill and they despised him, and he ended up in a unity government with Labour, actually, which did a pretty responsible job, Clement Attlee and those guys in World War II. Churchill, very late in life, Churchill, this story is told by Paul Johnson in his short biography of Churchill. I don't believe Paul Johnson, the late Paul Johnson, good writer though he was, an impressive person. I don't know if he always carefully fact-checked all of his stories. This is like too good to check, as we used to say in the magazine business. So there's a story, it was very old. Churchill was in his late 80s, and I took the elevator in the House of Commons. As I understand it, I don't really know the geography that well, but there's an elevator you can take up to the House of Commons, which is restricted to people who need to take the elevator. You're supposed to walk up those steps, in Westminster Abbey. But and so he was quite aged, so he took the elevator, and there was a young man who had on crutches because he had a skiing accident or something, and Churchill didn't know who he was, and he was just in awe. I mean, Churchill didn't come into the House of Commons much after he was Prime Minister, but he came for some reason on that day, and the young man said, I don't want to intrude, Sir Winston, but I just want to introduce myself and say, I'm on the other side, but I so much admire you. And Churchill said, which other side? And he said, Labour. Churchill kind of shook his head, said, liberals. I was always a liberal. Which is a nice statement, of a Churchill in his late 80s. Maybe a little bit of rewriting history there by Churchill too, I don't know, but I identify with that. So just a few points on the election, and then a couple of points maybe I will do a little bit more on the going forward part. I don't have any huge insights on the election that a lot of people don't have. I slightly disagree with Ross. It was a pretty big swing. I mean, all the California vote will come in, and we'll see what Trump's final margin will be. He'll probably be, what do you think, 50.5 or something in the popular vote, maybe, and he'll have about a 3 percentage point lead over Harris, at least, maybe 3.5. Biden led Trump by 4.5, right? So that's a 7.5, 8-point swing. That's big in modern elections. I think it's actually the biggest, it's biggest in a long time, maybe 04 to 08 is kind of comparable to that, I guess. But for the same person, this is the same person being on the ballot, getting that much of a movement over, is a real accomplishment by Trump. We shouldn't minimize what happened. And interestingly, the swing was bigger in the non-swing states. So one of my theories about the election, I thought Trump I thought it was 50-50, kind of conventional view, coin flip. I thought at the end she would win because she closed better, and Trump had Madison Square Garden, and Harris was normal, if I can put it that way, a normal Democratic candidate, very much like Biden in 2020. But incumbents have a tough time in this era since the pandemic and stuff, so that was a real burden, I think. In any case, I thought Trump's paid media was much better than, much more effective than Harris's. Brutal ads on immigration, the transgender prisoners, all 8 of them or whatever, who were having their sex changes being paid for, apparently by us, in prison. I guess they're also illegal immigrants, but at least they're in prison, which I think is consistent with what Trump wants. Anyway, they spent $150 million on that ad, I believe, on every swing state, on Pittsburgh Steelers games and so forth, and then just straightforward immigration ads. And those were tough. The the Harris campaign chose not to answer them. Maybe they were right, maybe they were wrong. That was internally debated. I think those did damage. I had a good friend who actually I was here at Harvard with many years ago. He's a lawyer in Western Pennsylvania who always was pessimistic because he just thought those ads were unresponded to, were doing too much damage in the Pittsburgh area, in the Pittsburgh suburbs, and among kind of working class voters in particular. So I thought Harris was a better candidate than Trump. The Harris campaign was a better run campaign than Trump's in terms of the events and the public stuff, the convention, the debate, but that Trump might win because of paid media. But I think that was wrong because the actual places where all the paid media was spent, the swing states, moved, of course, to Trump. He lost them in 2020 and he won them in 2024, but they typically moved, 4 points, I would say. I mean, if you think he lost them by 1 and won them 1 or 2, won them by 1 or 2 in this case.
3, maybe.
What's that?
Maybe 3 points. Yeah,
not even 4. Yeah, so I mean, not a massive delta. The biggest move was in the states where there was no advertising. This, I think, emphasizes the point, that Bill made, and Ross in a way too. The degree, this is where I do think it is a significant election. The places, in a funny way, wouldn't you say, the places where there's less paid advertising and people are just watching the news and thinking about the candidates, in a way is it's not a better snapshot exactly, but it's a more natural snapshot of the electorate. And if in Virginia and New Hampshire and New Jersey and in states like that, you have a pretty big move, 7, 8, 10 points to Trump, that's, for me, is more real. And you can make the counter argument that, well, the voters who are getting hammered with the advertising in a way are the ones who are more like in the real campaign. That's more what the future will look like. I don't have maybe political scientists who studied this. I don't know which is the right case. But it's very, very striking. I live in Virginia. Biden won it by 10, Harris won it by 5. We didn't have much in the way of contested races at any other level. So it was kind of just a pure referendum, as it were. We didn't have much advertising except for when they bought national TV for the World Series and the college football games and stuff. So it was a big move to Trump. I don't think one should kid oneself about that. I thought, Doug Sosnick, the former Clinton political director, Bill knows, I did a conversation with him a year ago, and he was very worried that Trump could win. And he stressed throughout, and I think this was important, the moment he thought Trump could really win was when the retrospective approval of Trump, especially on the economy, but really for his presidency overall, started to go up. And that was a sort of 2023 thing, I think, more than the first 2 years. And basically, people preferred the Trump presidency to the Biden presidency. Well, you have an ex-president running at that point, against the current president. So it's like, this is not a theoretical race of the challenger. We don't quite know too much about him. Who defines the challenger first? Romney, that kind of, which is one model of how presidential elections work, against an incumbent who, as Ross said, is defined by his record, and people don't like it, and you're Carter and you lose, and you're Reagan and if you like it, you win, and that's kind of straightforward political science, I would say. Very unusual, of course. We haven't had it in over a century to have an ex-president against a current president. We ended up not having that, actually. But once people, whatever the reason for it, whatever the, whitewashing of history in their minds about Trump, whatever their excessive dissatisfaction, in my view, with Biden, once you have two people running, you've seen them both as president, you prefer one of them as president to the other, why wouldn't Trump win at that point? I did think I was a very strong advocate for Biden not running for a second term from the very beginning, but particularly 2022, 2023, all the way into 2024, very annoyed my new sort of friends in the White House. When he got out and when Harris had a bit of a surge and probably really took a lead, pulled even with Trump basically from having been, Biden was clearly 3 or 4 points down and sinking. I did think there was a reasonable chance Harris could win, but for various reasons that Bill detailed and maybe some others as well, she didn't make it, and maybe it just wasn't going to happen anyway. She did run a little bit behind, I think, the average, behind most Democratic senators. Yeah. A little unclear where the House vote's going to end up. I would guess it'll end up +2 Republican maybe, so presidential vote will be +3 or 4 Republican. I think Trump will end up running ahead of the party. So for all people who think that, the Republican Party would be doing great if only Trump weren't there, I would like to think that as a judgment of the American voters. It's not clear that that's true, actually, as evidence. Trump has now won twice, which no other Republican, obviously Bush did it, but no one else has done it since Reagan, and Bush barely did it, and the first time. And as I say, he probably is going to end up running ahead of the more normie Republicans down ballot. So, which does mean, incidentally, what it means is in fact, that Trump will be very powerful when he comes to office. Let me just come back to that in a minute, but that's forward-looking and say one more thing just about the election. And the American people, as Bill and Ross both said, agreed with Trump in certain ways. January 6th was not disqualifying for a majority of them, which is unfortunate in my mind. It's hard to know, how many of them liked some of the things that are deplorable in my judgment about Trump, how many of them were for Trump despite those things. Clearly there are both camps exist. What the relative size of those is a hard thing to get from polling, I think. And people don't tell you the truth, and they say they don't like, of course he shouldn't say that, and then they kind of like the fact that he said it, right? I'm a little bit on the side of a lot of the things that people thought Trump was winning despite of, he won because of. And he said things that people felt they couldn't say. We can then have a long discussion about was it very bad that they felt they couldn't say these things, and that was just liberal, censorship, as it were, and cancel culture. Or maybe it's healthy for a country that people feel they shouldn't say certain things, and that Trump sort of released their inner id, and they liked that, it turned out, because it's fun to be able to say publicly the things that previously you only said late at night in a bar to your buddies and kind of with your voice not as loud. Another way of putting it is Trump did. I mean, I think this is very clear from both Russ and Bill's analysis. I mean, Trump got the votes a normal Republican candidate would have gotten with an unpopular president or a vice president running with a difficult task of explaining how she is and isn't different from the unpopular president. For me, what's so shocking is he didn't get every single one probably, but he got the huge bulk of the votes that a, quote, normal Republican would have gotten. Very hard for me to say that maybe Nikki Haley would have done a point or two better. I'm not so sure, incidentally. Maybe Nikki Haley would have done a point or two worse, one doesn't know. So that's the election. I mean, those are my brief thoughts on it. Going forward, I would say, a couple of minutes here, Trump benefited hugely. I say this as someone who tried to make the opposite argument, and we didn't particularly succeed, from his first term, in the sense that we survived the first term, the guardrails sort of held. The people who were in there held them, because guardrails don't guard themselves. Who guards the guardrails? It actually requires actual human beings to do that. The human beings who were in there in the first term were not mostly Trump loyalists, certainly not in the most senior positions. Or if they were sort of Trump loyalists, they weren't full-bore Trump loyalists. We know this because he fired most of them, and other ones resigned in disgust, including ones who were pretty loyal, like Bill Barr. So that, I think, gave the American public wildly excessive confidence that the second term would be like the first term. Now, it could be. It could be. Maybe the establishment is strong enough that it sneaks back in. Though I would say that the pick of J.D. Vance there is very important. His mission, and I mean this I do mean this in a critical way, but a negative way, but I don't mean it as a negative statement. I think he sees his mission as making sure that the second term is really a Trumpy second term. It's really Heritage's Project 2025, which he wrote a foreword to the book of the guy who the Heritage president, who's very proud of that. It really is America First, something that he has embraced full on. Why did Tom Cotton take himself out of running for defense of CIA yesterday? Because Tom Cotton voted with Mitch McConnell to recognize the electoral results on January 6th. And no one, in my view, who was against Trump on election denial will be given a senior position in the Trump White House or Trump cabinet, or at least not a really prominent one. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there'll be plenty of, if not quite Jim Mattis types, and if not quite Reince Priebus types, and if not quite even Jeff Sessions types. Maybe there'll be people one notch over who are still sort of more or less committed to various norms and institutions of liberal democracy, or maybe not. I mean, maybe we are talking about, Kash Patel and Rick Grinnell at CIA and Defense, and then we are in the world of November 3rd to January 6th. And that's been my view, that we are going to have a Trump administration that looks more like the administration he tried to create, luckily not very effectively and at the last minute, at the very end of his administration, and that was willing to go along with the attempt to overturn the election. That's what it's going to look like, more like than like the first term group. But I mean, that's something that's up in the air. I think we can see. He certainly campaigned on a whole bunch of things, and as Bill said, didn't back off them. I mean, deportation of 15 million people, maybe it won't be 15 million people. Maybe it'll be 1/3 that or 1/10 that. Still a lot of people. How will that work? Will he back off when people say, come on, you cannot have going through neighborhoods, picking people out of their workplaces or their homes and deporting them when they've been here for not just 1 year, but 5 years or 10 years and have children who are American citizens and so forth. Maybe he'll back off. Maybe he won't. Steve Miller doesn't want to back off. Stephen Miller is going to be a very senior person, in my view, in the Trump White House, or maybe he'll be running HHS or DHS. Maybe the business community will get him to back off on tariffs, which is a pretty a big departure from 80 years of American economic policy, which I would say has been good for America and good for the world. They think they can get him to back off. I'm not so sure. And for me, almost most importantly is Ukraine. Maybe half the Republicans in Congress did vote for Ukraine, for the aid package to Ukraine. Vance, of course, was against it. Trump's pretty much against it. Trump and Elon Musk are buddies of Putin. I'm very doubtful that you could sustain the aid to Ukraine in the way you could have, maybe, if Tom Cotton and others were in the cabinet, but let's see. I mean, that will be a big fights within the Trump administration. Some of us on the outside, I think, can try to influence that. We can certainly try to influence Republicans in Congress to simply go along with whatever Trump decides. But there, I think the size of the victory and by now the exiling of all Republican opponents to Trump makes it very hard to see what opposition there'll be in Congress. So I think we're looking at a very strong Trump with a very extreme agenda, was aided and abetted by people who really believe in it and have spent a lot of time working on it and have a lot of backing and resources. I mean, that's something I think the liberal establishment doesn't understand. There's a huge MAGA establishment now, and they are powerful, and they want a lot of these policies. Some of them, a lot of the business types just want whatever they want, lower taxes and business-friendly policies, and they kind of go along with the rest. But let's see if they really object to it. I'm very skeptical that some of these guardrails that are informal as well as actual constitutional guardrails will hold in a second term. So that's one reason people like me were so alarmed by the prospect of Trump. I hope I'm wrong. I think for my part, it's very important to oppose Trump, especially on these things, very early, not wait to see what he decides or how powerful Stephen Miller is, but try to really get opposition to some of that going even before he makes any decisions. But we'll see if how much Democrats are in quite a lot of disarray. Can they get organized? Can they use the levers of power intelligently? Will there be a lot of just demonstrative stuff, but not effective attempts to really make people start to pay a political price for some of these extreme things? I don't know. Bill quoted, I'll close, but Bill quoted Karl Marx. I'm sort of more respectful of Marx these days, personally. That there's. I say this is a critic of the left, not of the right, though. The left should be more Marxist, honestly. The left should think more about actual power and actual economic, weight and so forth, and be a little less interested in identity politics and gestures and all this sort of stuff. And I think actually Harris would have been better off running, in that respect, on the economic stuff, a much more populist campaign. I mean, why are the billionaires quite as wealthy as they are? Is it terrible that they could pay a little more in taxes? I mean, and the power they have now, and the degree to which Elon Musk is running his own kind of, government out there, and controlling a major media operation, but also obviously going into Pennsylvania and spending tens of millions of dollars. I guess this is right, but maybe one could criticize that. And worry a little about the national security implications of him running a major defense contracting firm, but also talking on the phone to Putin. I don't think that would be McCarthyism to ask him what exactly those conversations were about and to raise questions. But it's complicated. The Democrats had to be moderate, and they couldn't look left-wing in that respect, and they were scared of looking too populist in a certain way. They probably ended up with the worst of both worlds. They didn't look populist enough to make the economic arguments, and they were nonetheless could be portrayed as abnormally left. I do think that's, going forward, can be a big intellectual task of thinking through what is the right kind of liberalism in terms of economic policy for the 21st century. I mean, what is the New Deal? The New Deal was not a terrible thing. I don't want to shock people in this room, by making this point, but we seem to have come out of the Depression ultimately and did pretty well for the next 60, 70, 80 years with a kind of building on that order. It wouldn't be so terrible if there were a new version of it for the 21st century, but that requires actual thinking and creative thinking, and the Democrats are not terrible. There's going to be an awful lot of sniping at each other, lamenting the world, fanciful kind of search for fanciful solutions, I'm afraid. So the Marx point I would make is, what did Marx say about Hegel? That history repeats itself, but what Hegel didn't understand is that this is in the 18th Premiere, right? First time tragedy, second time farce. I mean, what makes me most worried about the next 4 years is that it could end up being first time farce, second time tragedy.
Are there points that you would like to make, the three of you, against what has been said by the others?
Are we allowed to say something in favor of what's been said about the others? Or is that against the spirit of the occasion? I want to underscore a couple of points that Bill Kristol made, and then pose a question to Ross, if that's okay. First of all, I absolutely agree with Bill that this was not an incrementally different campaign, right? This campaign was a big deal. It showed a major shift. Trump improved over his 2020 showing in 48 out of the 50 states. He improved his showing in 90% of all American counties, and he improved his showing across most demographic groups as well.
Can I interrupt just to point out that he improved his showing in Cambridge, Massachusetts? Based on my quick look at the numbers here, I've got to say the Massachusetts Secretary of State is not like they should get into the 21st century here with their presentation of numbers. But yes, he got 500 more votes in Cambridge, Massachusetts than he did in 2020.
Well,
so congratulations, really. Yes.
Some of them may even be in this room with us now.
But to put the point slightly more dramatically, he got almost 100,000 more votes out of New York City in 2024 than he did in 2020. If you start your analysis by assuming that in our polarized times that each party begins with about 46% of the vote, that's as low as McCain got, that's as low as Trump got, that's as low as Republicans or Democrats have gotten, which leaves 8% of the electorate. Trump moved almost half of that 8% in his direction. That was, whatever you think of it, politically or morally, it was a considerable tactical achievement with strategic results. If you want one more illustration, I just checked, and Bill is absolutely right. The state of New Jersey is regarded as a blue bastion. Biden won it by 16 percentage points in 2020. Harris won it by 5 points. That's an 11-point shift. That's not an incremental change. That's a big deal. So let me, second, I do want to suggest that this is an election with important consequences for the basic structure and strategy of both political parties. The fight within the Republican Party is over, right? And plus or minus 10%, it is going to be a populist nationalist party, I believe, for some time after Donald Trump leaves the scene. How long? I can't tell you. And if the second Trump term is a failure, then that will affect my judgment. And I think it may be. I think Mr. Trump has made a lot of sweeping promises that he's going to have a very hard time redeeming. And if he's led his supporters to believe that prices are actually going to go down from current levels, I think they're going to turn out to be extremely disappointed. I don't think that's going to happen without a deep recession or a depression. If that happens, then he's cooked anyway, and so is Trumpism. But barring catastrophe, I think it is now a working class-based populist nationalist party as far as the eye can see. Democratic Party, the old order's been wiped out, right? And this feels to me like a combination of 1980 and 1988. And it will lead to a period of fundamental rethinking within Democratic ranks, as I said, after the circular firing squad disbands. I can't predict what's going to come out of that, but I think I know as a general matter what is what is going to happen. And it will be a time of rethinking and a time of testing for my party, the Democratic Party. I began my remarks by talking about islands of stability. I cast my very first vote in 1968 for president. I voted for Hubert Humphrey. I realized that I was a Hubert Humphrey Democrat. I still am a Hubert Humphrey Democrat, but the world has changed around me. Now my question for Ross. Thinking about the basic orientation that you bring to your political analysis, would you describe yourself as a small L liberal, not in the John Kenneth Galbraith sense of that term, but in the John Locke sense of that term? And if not, why not?
So we've passed from Bill Kristol's political progress to my own. I think that the way that I usually answer that, and I'll do it again here, is to say that I am a skeptic of philosophical liberalism who is content to live under political liberalism, seeing no more obvious, stable, or humane alternative. I would have said that before Trump, and I think I would still say that now. If you ask me to sign on to the anthropology of either Locke or John Stuart Mill, to take the two strongest candidates for English language founders of liberalism. I have a friend at Yale who's convinced me that it's Benjamin Constant who's the real figure. But sticking with Locke or Mill, I would not endorse pieces of their worldview, but I would not endorse their anthropology, their philosophical perspective. But to the extent that the order that we have is liberal, I have no desire to see it replaced. And I will use that to segue quickly towards a point that Bill raised, which is, I think, one of the important things to understand about the peculiar position that we find ourselves in is that many people who either ended up voting for Trump or who drifted, I guess, along with me into this sort of ambivalent, this category of ambivalence that draws considerable ire from publications like The Bulwark, is in part that a lot of people felt that liberalism was not only under threat from Donald Trump. Liberalism is not just a particular style of politics, it is also a culture, a way that non-governmental as well as governmental organizations institute themselves, a way that universities like Harvard institute themselves. And a lot of people in the last 4 to 6 years have felt that in order to remain liberal, they have to move right in certain ways. I would say, for instance, everyone associated with the project of my former colleague Barry Weiss at the Free Press would frame their perspective on this era that way. And her publication has Trump voters, it had Harris voters, it had people who, abstained or voted otherwise. It was not sort of a Trumpist formation, but it was a formation that represented a different view than the Bulwark has, right, of the moment that we're in. And I think that view is basically right. I think that liberalism, the kind of liberalism, there's many kinds of liberalism, but the kind of liberalism that we experienced after the fall of the Berlin Wall, a sort of Fukuyaman period of, sort of consensus, confidence, a certain degree of stability, and like pretty narrow parameters on, how far left or right anyone was likely to go. That period of liberalism is over. Nothing is going to bring it back. Deeper forces even than populism and Trumpism are at work. Everything from, the internet and AI to, my personal hobby horse of the coming depopulation of the globe. These are all forces that make that order unsustainable. So liberalism will have to reinvent itself. And part of the contests of the Trump era, the populist era, is, what does that reinvention look like? And you just have different dynamics at work. In Europe, in Europe, you have a lot of liberals who are anxious about democracy, right? Who are willing to sort of use illiberal means to try and thwart populist right-wing parties that they see as threats to the liberal part of liberal democracy, privileging that against democracy itself. Who are the liberals in that fight? It's not always entirely clear. Donald Trump is, a guy who will not accept defeat in an election and threatens the constitutional stability of the United States because of that. And I'm not trying to, for my own part, paper over or cover over that aspect of Trump. But I know people who, were sort of supportive not of January 6th itself, but of sort of the protest against the election result. And, they had what I thought were, false conspiratorial views of what had happened in that election. But they didn't think of themselves as, the way genuine 1930s right-wingers in Germany thought of themselves, right, as trying to replace liberal democracy. They thought they were vindicating liberal democracy. I think they were deluded, but that's what they thought. So I just think it is a more complex landscape, and there's more contestation over where the threats to liberalism come from than you can sort of, than you get if you just distill the whole debate to Trump's threats to the order as we have known it, which again, I will stipulate are real. And just to say something forward-looking, I don't agree with everything Bill said, but I think I agree with some of it. Sorry, Kristol. I mean, I agree with. I think I agreed 97% with you.
Guess that should trouble both of us.
That should trouble. Maybe it should trouble Harvey for inviting. Professor Mansfield. I think a second Trump administration is an incredibly high variance and high risk affair, and I think there are certain things that I do think it is unlikely that in the end, the full Stephen Miller will happen on immigration, or the full, the full tariffs on everything will happen. But I don't think, I completely agree. I don't think we can say that with certainty. I think any vision of a second Trump administration success absolutely rests on the ability of people who are more committed to the broad Trumpian project than the cast of characters in his first term to nonetheless act as restraints on Trump's wilder ideas, more excessive ideas, and his cruelty. And I have, let's say, some areas where I have more hopes and scenarios of optimism for a second Trump administration, but I don't think anyone should kid themselves about the risks and the ways that things can go wrong. I think if things do go wrong, it's unlikely to end in the end of American democracy, a Trumpian dictatorship. I think it's more likely to end the way the first Trump presidency did, in some sort of chaotic landscape of empowered radicalisms, a very unpopular president, and democratic political success, but success that comes at a great cost to the country. So I'm rooting against that scenario, but I want to stipulate its plausibility.
I will just make one point. I haven't heard anything about Trump that would suggest any superiority in him, any point that one should be impressed by. And
right.
Let me suggest one, and that's in his slogan, "Make America Great Again." Great. That he sees America, thinks of itself as great. His opponents don't. His opponents find the ambition of greatness to be embarrassing and unjustified. And I think that his slogan is working for him. What about that?
Great is great. It's the again that I object to.
I mean, it's not worth. The slogan probably did work for him. It worked for Reagan, and Reagan managed to have that slogan without bringing along the more unseemly aspects of greatness or pseudo-greatness. I don't know. Biden spends all his time talking about, this is not America. America's unique, exceptional. He's got very conventional rhetoric on that. I don't know if he maybe doesn't use the word greatness quite as much because Trump hijacked it, so to speak. Harris's convention speech was all about what a great country this is.
But Okay.
I know you guys don't think
But you
that.
know what?
You think that I know what you mean, because you know what? Because at Harvard you can't say it. And so the fact that Harris actually believes it and is the daughter of immigrants who actually experience what is actually great about America, incidentally, which is that all these people came here because they wanted to live in America and they've done very well in America.
Didn't one of her parents move back to Jamaica?
This is the level we're now at, right? I mean, seriously.
What do you mean? No, I just mean like,
She's
do
not
you think?
entitled to be, she's not
No,
entitled
she's
as
entitled.
the daughter of immigrants?
She's absolutely entitled. No, I'm not. I'm not making some sort of racial point. I'm just saying you're saying like she comes from a family that embraced the promise of America, and I'm saying that her estranged father did not, right?
Well, maybe. I don't know the details of that, but she did.
Okay, yeah.
But if you want to hold her responsible for the father, that's fine.
No, I'm not holding
Donald Trump's father came here and marched in Ku Klux Klan parades, and that's part of America too.
I'm not holding her. I retract the snide point.
Anyway, I don't want to. I just don't think it's really true that. I don't know what Democrat thinks. I mean, some of them are goofier than others. There is a clique on the left who very much object to American exceptionalism. On the other hand, I've got to say, having gone through the last 10 years, are we so confident that it's been a great thing that Americans have spent the last 20 years on the right, especially patting themselves on the back about how exceptional we are? What exceptional thing has this generation have we done? Our ancestors did a lot of exceptional things. They set up a system that is exceptional. They fought wars that were exceptional. An awful lot of people on the right pat themselves on the back about American exceptionalism while indulging in pretty vulgar behavior and pretty unexceptional behavior in terms of democracy, in terms of other things. Final point while I'm on this tirade here. Who exactly among European liberals is embracing wildly illiberal means? Is Macron walked away from liberal democracy? The German SPD or the Free Democrats walked away from liberal democracy? Zelensky, Radek Sikorski in Poland, Pavel in Prague, are they not pretty good liberals?
I would say that actually much of Western Europe currently exists. I mean, I don't want to get too far into the details because it's probably not that relevant, but much of Western Europe maintains a sort of regime of political speech policing that, if were introduced to America, would be denounced as fascism. I think by both political parties, to their credit. I think elements of this have strengthened in recent years. I think the strategies that the German system uses against the AfD, again, maybe for necessary or essential reasons, given the history of Hitlerism and Nazism, are functionally, those are not illiberal exactly so much as attempts to sort of constrain the expression of democratic opinions. I mean, I think it's a genuinely widely understood perspective that Western European political parties have sought to exclude from participation in government aspects of their political cultures that, again, they deem too dangerously fascist adjacent to be acceptable, and that's their perspective. But it is a sort of functionally anti-democratic matter. I would add that the UK in recent years has started arresting people for praying silently outside abortion clinics, to raise another issue on which your perspective has evolved in recent years, Bill. So, I mean, I could go into further detail. I mean, the uses of British police forces to arrest and imprison and harass people for posting on social media could be cited as an example. I think there's obviously broad trends in Western European sort of establishmentarian politics that involve attempted sort of management of democratic politics and public speech in an effort to prevent, Marine Le Pen, Trumpian forces, whatever you want to cite, to come to power. I don't think this is a controversial thing to say. You can say it doesn't go all the way to liberal fascism, to cite a different book of not recent vintage anymore, but it's not, John Stuart Mill is not in charge of speech in France and Germany, right?
Well, just a couple of things. I mean, we don't want to get into a long discussion about it, and I probably don't know enough to have a detailed discussion. I'm on the American side of the First Amendment, as opposed to the elements, if you will, of cancel culture and limitations on speech. But that's very different, and I really object to your eliding over to forming coalition governments that exclude the Alliance for Deutschland. Yeah, I am for that.
That's
that is
not
called,
no. I'm talking about using
liberalism is so weak. Look at Weimar. Liberalism is so weak it can't stand up for itself. Then the Germans decide, hey, you know what? We're not going to go down the path of Weimar. Oh my God, they're excluding the Alliance for Deutschland from the government.
No, I'm talking about using domestic police forces to spy on the Alliance for Deutschland, which again might be necessary to avoid the return of Nazi Germany, but is more in the line of, sort of compromising liberalism in order to save it. I agree that it is not illiberal to form coalitions against far-right parties.
We're getting off the subject.
Wait, let me say something about greatness, though. Let's push this disagreement further. I agree with Professor Mansfield that not only is the slogan greatness relevant to Trump's appeal, but so is the fact that in his bizarre way, he clearly is, a sort of Hegelian, historical force in ways that do not necessarily make him worthy of your support, don't make him a good person, certainly, but I think absolutely, just his reaction, obviously, to the assassination attempt, the extent to which Trump sort of appears, he is an engenderer of iconic photography in a way that few contemporary politicians are. Like, yes, these are things that are relevant to his appeal in ways that, I myself have had to sort of accept as a reality of our politics over the last 8 years. You cannot escape the fact that Donald Trump, to take a more absurd example, Donald Trump leaning out of a McDonald's window is a act of political iconography that didn't have any parallel on the Democratic side. And also was, if he is a fascist, was a fascinating way of sort of muting his fascism. Like, how can you be a fascist if you're serving people fries out the McDonald's window? Like, you can have you can think, not the lowest, but you can have the most alarmist possible perspective on Trump. You can think that he is the American Hitler in waiting, and it behooves you to reckon with the extent to which he dominates the imagery and the culture of our time in a way that I would never have expected 10 years ago.
Yeah. So, Ross, I've given up on you as a future graduate student.
Yeah.
So you can call me Harvey.
Yeah. Since I uttered one sentence,
yes.
I restrained myself to one sentence in response to your question,
yes.
which evoked 15 minutes of controversy.
Yeah.
I think, can I reclaim a little bit of my time?
Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm looking to you as the chair of these august proceedings. I would comment just in passing that 2 generations ago, the bitterest fights were between communists and ex-communists. And today they may be between conservatives and ex-conservatives. But I'm glad you asked your question, because there's something real at stake here. 2 things, actually. Number one, we are talking not about a great man, but a great country. The slogan is not make Trump great again. It's make America great again. And that invites a serious conversation about what the greatness, actual or prospective, of America consists in. And I think that's a conversation worth having, but the transformation of greatness into a political slogan, I think, has militated against that conversation, although perhaps you might argue it's opened the door for it. Point number 2, as I said, the piece of that slogan that worries me is not the great, it's the again, because it suggests that there was a time then that America was better than it now is. And I'm not just referring to Trump's first term, which may be what he has in mind now. I'm referring to the question of the historical judgments, the basis of the historical judgments that would go into the proposition that, for example, the country was better in the 1950s than it is today. I choose the 1950s not by accident, because I committed an act of political science 10 years ago that I've repeated yearly ever since. Into a poll that my institution helps to craft, We inserted the question, do you think America today is better or worse than it was in the 1950s? And the population of this country is divided down the middle on that question, not by accident. And that is a serious discussion. When people say the 1950s were better, what do they mean? When people who object to that and say, no, today for all of its problems represents progress over the 1950s, what do they mean? That's the conversation, which we're not having.
No, because it is 2024, and with all due respect to my elders, almost no one alive today remembers the 1950s. The actual substance and the place where Trump has indeed won votes with that again is periods that actual middle-aged Americans remember. And he has appealed in various ways to people who remember the Reagan era and sort of the go-go Wall Street years when Trump himself rose to prominence. He has appealed in the RFK stuff to sort of aging hippies who remember the 1970s as this time when the country felt freer and more footloose than it does today, and when people took a lot of drugs. And he has appealed to people like me who do think that America in my lifetime peaked around 1999 and that the 1990s were pretty awesome, and I would happily get a lot of aspects of them back. Now, if you want to say that those are all grave, mistaken forms of nostalgia, that's fine, but let's at least recognize that when Trump goes on Joe Rogan doesn't remember the 1950s, and he doesn't want them back. Joe Rogan does remember the late 1990s, and I bet is nostalgic for them, and that's where the contest is. For better or worse.
As probably the only person in this room who served in the Clinton administration, I am delighted to agree with you about the excellences of 1999.
Also a good time for conservative magazines.
Let's have a question or two. Yes, Paul.
I think this builds on the closing discussion here, but it goes in a different direction than the initial presentations. I did not hear any discussion of Donald Trump as a felon. We have had, what, 6 trials? I can't. How many trials are ongoing? And how many? We've got one conviction. We're waiting for next week to hear whether or not he's going to be ordered to jail or not, and whether he's going to actually serve time. But we have lots of other things. So I thought before the election that if Kamala Harris wanted to separate herself from the Biden administration and to put her foot forward, the politics of joy, there was one thing she could have done that could have changed the conversation and maybe could have elected her. And that was to say, I promise to pardon Donald Trump.
I mean, she can't pardon him for the one thing he's been convicted of, since it's a state trial. Just to
No,
begin with
if
that.
convicted, yes, he can. She could say, okay, if he's convicted, I will
He has
pardon
been
him.
convicted. He's appealing. She literally can't pardon that. It's a state trial.
Yeah, but there was a
Now,
federal case.
she
There's
could
two
pardon him
federal
for
cases
stealing
going
all the
forward.
classified documents, for which friends of mine paid great price, who did much less egregious versions of walking out with things they shouldn't have paid great price in terms of actual fines and at least suspended sentences in jail. I guess she could have promised to suspend that trial that case before it went to trial. But in fact, Trump's appointee did a good job of never letting that case come to trial. So
no, the point is that she should have added the sentence. I would not do this he doesn't deserve it, but the country deserves it. We need to put this into the past.
that might be. I mean, I don't know.
Well, how did it work out for Jerry Ford when he pardoned Richard Nixon?
Yeah, but that's the same party. You see, this is a spirit of generosity that crosses party lines.
All right.
All right, in that spirit, let's pause for supper. He serves outside.
It's my honor to be the moderator for this part of the program, and we'll take questions from the audience, and we will have to stop exactly at 8 o'clock because Ross needs to get going and other people need to get going too. So, Dan.
I'm Dan Carpenter. I teach here at Harvard and chair the government department. I just want to thank all of you for coming today again, and Harvey once again for putting this on. I guess I wanted to return to this question of kind of, the missing analysis of Trump, and we got into it right at the end of the session before dinner. And I remember having this moment of both dissonance and appreciation when I was visiting. It was the first visit I paid to my hometown in northern Michigan after COVID. When I was going through a small town in a window, I saw this flag of Trump, and it was the Rambo-Trump, right? The Trump with just these amazing muscles, and the bandana and things like that. And I realized that, and yet this wasn't put up as a joke by the left. This was, this was a projection of masculinity and of the defense of America. Not just Rambo as muscle man, but Rambo as the kind of person who would defend the American project, as in the movies, that a lot of people bought into. And I guess I wanted to ask, a question or pose some hypothesis. First about maybe a positivist appreciation for Trump in that he seems very good at this. Ross mentioned this at the end with the iconography. And second, that when that is potentially made fragile, that's when we might potentially see the worst of Trump. So on him being very good at this, let me just say that this is universal, right? The image making of the ruler and of the candidate is as old as electoral politics and probably beforehand. And we see it, we saw it with other presidents or presidential candidates, the Shepard Fairey images of Obama, the Shepard Fairey images of Kamala Harris. And a certain kind of pose, and part of it, I think Ross mentioned this in the point about McDonald's, which was a deeply class dynamic. As part of this is just Trump is good at this in a way that his detractors and critics don't get. That he is actually able to come across as a man of the people, in spite of his past, the way he speaks, things like that. Part of it strikes me a little bit as curation, though, in the sense that I think he's clearly got some people around him who are good at it, or that there are unwitting enablers out there, say CNN or the New York Times, who every time they project an image of Trump as absolutely horrifying, other people see that as deeply admirable. Or the way that, say, in kind of new evangelical or Christian nationalist iconography, he has become kind of the anointed in a different way. So that these structures out there that kind of do this for Trump, but he's also good at performing it. And to what extent is he kind of unique, maybe the first person since Reagan or before, that he has just changed American politics in that way, just to be able to kind of, this is what masculinity is now. This is what national pride is now, things like that. And he has kind of established a default hold on that. The worry is, my biggest worries about Trump moving forward are that not so much that he's going to start, and Bill, you might be right. He might start with Kash Patel and Grinnell and all these others. I think the first term, if the first term is in any indication, things will be fine as long as he feels adored and admired and not threatened. But it's precisely when COVID hit, when his position became fragile, that going into the election and the election season in 2020, and as the election got closer and COVID got crazier, that's when he became his most authoritarian. January 6th was at some level, the epitome of that, the asymptote of that. But at some level, you saw it in the response to the marches in Washington, D.C. in June 2020. a number of other things. And so I guess it's a question, number one, about has he changed the imagery of American politics? And when his own self-image or external image begins to suffer, is then potentially, is he at his most tyrannical going forward?
I mean, I always feared him because I think he's a very good demagogue. I used to argue with a lot of liberal friends who dismissed him. I always thought he had a chance to win, and I remember saying on TV that he had a 1 in 4 chance to win, I thought, in 2016, which was, still thought Hillary was going to win, but sort of like Ross, I thought he could be formidable. He's been a con man and a showman for 50 years. And, when he was successful, I mean, we can make fun of the bankruptcies and the failed projects, but he kept bouncing back. He has a real, I'd say the most admirable or impressive in a certain way characteristic of his is that just incredible, relentless will to power, of a certain kind of power. No, I'm seriously, and that is important in politics. And he just, he does something and it blows up, and 2 days later he does something else. He's very experimental in that way. I mean, a friend of mine who's used to being on presidential campaigns was very struck in 2015 that he had this sort of stump speech with different parts, and he was incredibly sensitive to what worked and what didn't work. And immigration worked, and especially the combination of immigration on the southern border and Muslim immigrants who were not coming here particularly, but were coming. But there was a huge migrant crisis in Europe, which Fox News was busy dramatizing even more. And then there were a couple of terrorist attacks, terrible attacks in France, the thing is San Bernardino, and he conflated it all together. And he was not an anti-immigration guy. I knew the conservative movement. Ross knew at that time too. He wasn't involved. I mean, there were plenty of businessmen and other public figures who were involved. I mean, I think in a sincere way, let's just say, on the restrictionist side of immigration. They gave money to relevant think tanks, and he had no interest in any of that. He married immigrants, he hired immigrants, he lived in a city full of immigrants. He didn't seem to have any, I mean, I think he had some normal bigotries of his generation, maybe on race a little bit, but otherwise he was not obsessed with immigration as an issue. He lived there in New York. He didn't move away from this, place teeming with immigrants and foreigners and people speaking different languages. It worked politically, and he is shameless and it's not unintelligent about it. So I think the con man, showman side of him is very underrated. The celebrity side of him, the TV side of him. Someone told me a story of Trump. In the Biden debate, because it was this year's Biden, for the one debate with Biden, the Biden team, they did what incumbent, his staff went and checked it all out. They briefed him, and Biden showed up 50 minutes before the debate. Trump showed up 90 minutes before the debate, walked through exactly where he was going to stand, where Biden was going to stand, where the cameras were, which cameras would be on when, didn't just take his staff's word for it. He talked directly to the people running, the kind of operation. I mean, all that combination of TV experience, showman, con man, willingness to be a shameless demagogue is powerful. So I very much agree with you that that's been very underestimated by people who just assume they can't pull this off forever. You add to that, and this is where I'm very worried about the second term, you add to that an actual movement now, which is powerful on the MAGA side. It's not like there's no, everyone at Brook, I was at the thing at Brookings, Bill's think tank, and I made this comment, and they were, Brookings, I made a comment in passing that Heritage's budget was larger this year than Brookings. And one of the people nicely said to me as trustees, but I mean, Brookings, is Brookings establishment, and stuff, has real influence. And I said, I mean, you can think that. Heritage is the main think tank advising the person who had at that point a 50-50 chance of becoming president of the United States. Why the liberal establishment is not as powerful as the MAGA establishment. Maybe at Harvard it is, presumably, though. But the number of places in the media world, incidentally, who's the most powerful figure in American media? Murdoch, I would say. Number two, Murdoch and Musk. 1 and 2 or 2 and 1. I said this at some meeting with some New York Times and Post people, and they were all, well, that's not really the media. Well, maybe it isn't, but I mean, the actual people who are reading what Elon Musk decides the algorithm will say, the actual people who are being driven by Murdoch. So I do think one of the reasons of Trump's success, not to go, is just been a slowness in catching up to his own abilities of a kind. And then the fact that there's now, and this didn't exist really in 2015-16, a big infrastructure underneath him. And it's got sort of respectable elements and unrespectable elements and Joe Rogan elements, and which isn't quite his, but is allied. But it's a big, again, you talk, I'm sorry, Gonta, but I think Ross would confirm this. You talk to people, it's like Joe Rogan, he's got that podcast, doesn't he? Joe Rogan's audience is 10 times larger than that I'm making this up, but it's something close to this, of the New York Times or the Washington Post. And it's a real audience. It's not like, oh, they've heard of him. They're listening to him. Actually, the New York Times, Washington Post, it's more like they read one or two things that they want to read, and the rest of the paper they don't read. So there's just a massive underestimation in terms of the media as well, of the degree to which there's a real powerful movement out there.
Go ahead.
No, I was just about to say, your question deserves a response from all three of us. But if all three of us respond to each question, then we won't get through the question. So to be continued, Dan.
Should I say? I'll try to be very quick. 3 points. One, I think that there is a curation of Trump's image, but there is also a curation by his own audience, where there are versions of Trump where you listen to him and you aren't impressed. Like the second half of his convention speech, the back half of most of his rally speeches now, and you're like, well, how could anybody, think this guy should be president, right? And the reality that I have noticed over, in talking to Trump supporters for years is that people just tune, there's a lot of tuning out of Trump, right? Yes, there are people who hang on his every word, who are like people I know who watch the convention speech and are like, I loved it all, that's my Trump, right? But then there's a lot of people for whom Trump is the clips, the jokes, the photos, the memes, the like physical stick-to-itiveness, the willingness to like stand up and take slings and arrows and so on. But yeah, the curation runs both ways. That's one point. Second point, I think it's a really interesting point about COVID, because my read on the COVID era was always that Trump actually completely shrank again and again from opportunities to sort of take power during that period. It was only at the end when his claim to win the election was threatened that he became sort of overtly, sort of anti-democratic, whatever. That during COVID itself, that was like the true fascist would have seized that moment. And he didn't want anything to do with it. He just wanted the stock market to go up, and he didn't want to hear about it until like Tucker Carlson in a different incarnation, like fought his way through the crowds of, disease-carrying guests at Mar-a-Lago, the Mask of the Red Death, right, and talked Trump into taking it seriously. I guess you could say that, the protests in D.C., there was, it was a situation where, he fled to the bunker, and I think he was shamed by that, and that, I think, led to the next day's performance with, clearing the square and having the upside-down Bible and all that craziness. So I do think you're probably onto something about the sense of but it isn't like, if there's an opportunity for power, he'll seize it. It's more like, if he feels shamed or threatened, he's more dangerous. Final point, just on Bill's point, Kristol, not Galston's wise counsel to us not to talk too much. I agree that there is a structure under him in a way now that's much of people who are committed to the project, but they all want different things. What Heritage wants is completely different, not completely different, there's some overlap, but it's very different from what Musk wants, notwithstanding like J.D. Vance's connection to Project 2025 or whatever. There's quite a bit of distance between Vancian populism and Vivek Ramaswamy libertarianism. There's still there's more people committed to Trump, but there's still a deep incoherence to the substructure that I think will manifest itself in all kinds of conflicts within the administration.
Sir. Microphone?
Question, so I'll be brief. I've been coming across from the UK to visit my family since 1980 for the presidential elections. And just to go to your point, first of all, which is my memory's pretty foggy, but hippies who remember the 60s and 70s weren't there. So now, Professor Mansfield made the point that science should quantify. So my first question is, how would you quantify how Trump made America great again in his first term? And secondly, when I came in 2016, Michael Dukakis spoke at Harvard to some Japanese students, and he talked about Trump getting in. It was a distinct possibility. This was the day before the election. But he said the American Constitution and the structures were strong enough to withstand anything that he was going to bring to it. So my question is, if he wins the Senate, and which he will, and the presidency, and the Supreme Court, and the House of Representatives, what are the checks and balances in the next 4 years?
Well, as Bill Kristol, pointed out, the question of who will guard the guardrails is absolutely fundamental. One of the things that makes me as optimistic as I can get myself to be in these circumstances is America's strong system of federalism. And federalism, I mean, if we had a central government, the way so many countries in Europe do, and to some extent the way the UK does, I'd be even more worried than I am. But under our constitutional structure, there are multiple centers of political power that by design are not under the direct control of the federal government. And that's, and that turns out to be enormously important, as we've discovered, in the case of abortion, where it's one thing for the Supreme Court, to, overturn Roe v. Wade, and it's a very different thing to make that overturn fundamental in the law of the 50 states. And as we saw in the 2020 election, the resistance of one Republican Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, made it impossible for President Trump to overturn the free and fair election in Georgia. And as we saw in 65 court cases, 64 of which were decided against him, many of them by Republican judges, not, and even a few by judges whom he personally had appointed. What that tells me is that despite the strong likelihood that he will enjoy unified government, as he did during his first 2 years of his first term, I am not completely without hope that if he tries to go off the rails legally or constitutionally, that there will be forces of resistance. And I know that there are a bunch of people who are going to be working starting yesterday to do everything they can to fortify those centers of legitimate resistance to illegal or unconstitutional activity. That too gives me hope.
Very quickly, I would add that sometimes it's not even constitutional procedures as just democracy itself that creates safeguards. Like, why didn't Brian Kemp and Brad Raffensperger go along with Donald Trump? Well, partially it was because they were good, patriotic public servants. But to be slightly more cynical, it was also that Georgia is a contested state in which 2 Republican senators went down to defeat in that very same span of time. And the incentives for those public servants had their own time horizons, right? Like they were assuming that, Trump would not be in power forever. There would be another election and they would have to face the voters. And so in the case of the current, excuse me, if Republicans, let's say, have 53 senators, right, 5 or 10 of those senators are going to be senators whose seats are vulnerable in any given election. And does that mean they won't go along with Trump on a lot of things? No, they'll go along with Trump on a lot of things. But things that are perceived as especially outrageous, they will have democratic incentives to blink. Like if you go back to Trump's first term, this wasn't even voted on, but the child separation policy, right? As soon as it attracted serious public attention, no Republican in Washington, I mean, there were some, but few Republicans in Washington wanted to be associated with that policy or defend it. And so it was sort of walked back, under pressure. Now, to Bill Kristol's point, the landscape is somewhat different now. There's more support for deportation, in part because of the immigration crisis under Biden. The landscape may be different, but that is an example of where, when Trump is perceived as going too far in the court of public opinion, Republican officialdom unless it really believes that he's going to rule for 1,000 years, right, is going to have some strong incentives to sort of say, well, not that far, I think.
Bill, do you want? Yep. Question here. Yeah, let's keep the questions short so we can get a lot of questions in.
I was interested in the panel's opinions about. I think there is a great truth to the statement that political orders are meant to serve and satisfy the needs of the citizenry, and it seems that maybe this is an oversimplification, maybe it's optimism, but my question is: to what extent is this victory attributable to rising food prices, a crisis in the standard of living, or are there more structural forces? In your opinion, in play? Short and sweet.
Well, I'll start. I think there are deeper structural forces in play. Some of them are conflicts within the culture, and some of them are pervasive sentiments in the citizenry. Let me give you just one example. The Economist magazine conducts a weekly survey that's quite comprehensive, and fortunately they release every detail of every survey so you can actually learn a lot from them. One of their questions goes like this, I'll paraphrase. Do you think that basically things are under control in the United States today or out of control? And for more than 2 years, in control, 20%, out of control, 80%. I have come to believe that that sense that things have somehow gotten out of control is in the background of a lot of what's going on, and it opens the door to the exercise of strong authority. And in times when people feel imperiled, insecure, they are willing to set certain restraints in the use of power aside in order to have their sense of insecurity allayed. I believe that we're in one of those periods. And I've drawn some lessons from that, one of which is that the forces in the United States who are trying to defend and strengthen the institutions and the civic culture of democracy should pay careful attention to the sources of instability and insecurity in the country and make as part of their core mission allaying those fears. Because as long as they're pervasive and as long as there are objective grounds for these fears, I think democracy will be on the defense. And I think that's not true just in the United States, but everywhere.
Vicki?
Thank you so much, all of you. I want to go back to the Make America Great again discussion. And just briefly, I want to make an observation, which I've always taken that slogan to have the emphasis on great and not on America, because my understanding is that Trump is fundamentally un-American in his overt rejection of the rule of law in American institutions. My blood ran cold the first time I heard him say that he could not lose a fair and free election, and I have never heard another American statesman say that. And then there are other institutions that he minimizes. Helsinki, preferring Putin's word over the FBI. Woodward has a new book, War, where he discusses how Trump's national intelligence director said that Trump's relationship with Putin is an enigma and he can't explain it. And he said with a question mark, blackmail. So I'm wondering what this sort of changing understanding of America means when we embrace that statement, make America great again.
I would say that there's I would make a distinction. I think Trump has a certain kind of admiration for authoritarian leadership joined to a self-regard large enough to, be unable to accept himself as the loser of an election. And I think it is fair to call part of that combination un-American. At the same time, I also think Trump is just deeply, fundamentally American in really profound ways that the others have touched on and so on. But like the character, he is both, he moves back and forth between the character of the great tycoon and the character of the con artist. And those are both, obviously there are tycoons and con artists around the world, but those are just really American types that are close, and the line between them, the Gatsbyan, we'll call it the Gatsby line, right? Like, that's just really close to the heart of our national identity. Liking Putin, un-American, like just mistrusting the FBI. There's a reason that Trump has attracted the support of many erstwhile leftists. Like, go back and watch Oliver Stone's JFK, right? Oliver Stone is probably he's like semi-pro-Trump, right? I don't know. I forget his evolution. He ended up sort of. He's pro-Putin, right? but in a different way. So Trump. So okay, let's make this distinction. Oliver Stone is pro-Putin because he's anti-American in a way that only an American can be. Whereas I think Trump is pro-Putin and more like, he's a tough guy, I like that, which is a little more un-American. I don't know if that distinction works, but I just think a lot of the sort of paranoia about American institutions that you hear from Trump, when he's like, people are like, well, Putin's a killer. He's like, you think we're so innocent? That's an American sentiment. I grew up with crunchy left-wing people who express sentiments like those kind of sentiments all the time in the 1980s, right? So I think you can call aspects of Trumpism un-American, but you can't disown him. He's our brother in some fundamental and profound way. And also the ways in which the things that he wants, like he's going to be president for the 250th, right? No more, like, he's going to love it in a way that is American and maybe toxic and may horrify you, but the fireworks, nobody loves a fireworks display, I bet, like Donald John Trump.
Well, good question, Becky. Starting where Ross left off, I think that at the heart of his admiration for authoritarian leaders is envy at their ability to proceed according to their will without institutional constraints. In other words, there's nothing about the means that constrains the pursuit of the ends. And one thing about institutions, and especially our Constitution, is that it's more about means than it is about ends. Obviously, you can read the preamble and try to draw things out of it. I've committed that exegetical sin myself. However, what it mainly concerns is how intentions can be translated into actions binding on the political community. What you can do, and equally important, what you can't do. And to the extent that being American involves some version of what Abraham Lincoln called reverence for the Constitution, impatience with constitutional means, in my judgment, is per se, on its face, anti-American. The belief in authority unchecked by other authority is profoundly anti-American. I am a Madisonian in my bones.
But Emerson is American too.
Yeah, and he's the part of America that I loathe, precisely because of that, right? And and I say that because the spirit, institutional restraint. Back up a step. The single most important thing about the U.S. Constitution and the thought that went into it was the determination of the founders to reduce to an absolute minimum the threat of tyranny in the United States. The Constitution is first and foremost an anti-tyranny document. And to question the authority of the Constitution, to say that you have the right to overturn it, is in principle the spirit of tyranny. That's what scares me most.
Over here.
Mostly a question for Ross. I appreciated the assessment that we're in a post-liberal moment where to preserve aspects of liberalism, we'll need to compromise certain aspects of the preceding decades of what that looked like. And I was intrigued by the assessment that Europe has found one solution, Trumpism might be another, and it's one we should be cautious of, but I'm curious what the best case scenario is on your read. If this goes from being a disruptive moment to a new normal, Trump doesn't run for a second term, but we have a new Republican Party with a new system, what's the best case for what that might look like?
Well, first, I'm not convinced that we would have a new system so much as, I mean, America has reinvented itself without abandoning the Constitution, and we can argue about, the genesis of liberalism and were the founding fathers liberal or small r Republican or whatnot. But I think it is possible to reinvent American society without crossing, the Galstonian Rubicon, if you will, right? And I think that reinvention is less likely in the end to be a fundamentally political project as it is to be a cultural and socioeconomic project that sort of restores an element of basic confidence in the non-Madisonian element in American life and Trump has tapped into this sort of crisis of confidence, right? And it's an economic crisis, as a fear, right, that we've heard a lot about, that the next generation won't be better off and so on, that aspect of the American promise is slipping away. But then there's also just a sort of psychological and metaphysical confidence that Americans have always had that's been rooted primarily in Protestant Christianity that has itself entered into different kinds of crisis over the last 50 or 60 years. But it is a confidence in the dynamic future that is really important to America. Europe is a separate case, and we could have a separate conversation, but we can't tonight. And I'm much more pessimistic about the European future. I think in America, if you want to be optimistic about the American future, you would say that relative to other parts of the developed world, we just seem to still have more resources in terms of economic and commercial dynamism, people starting families, people believing in God, people doing things that express a cosmic optimism. And I think getting that back at scale is essential. And I think for the liberal side of our split, it's a harder, liberalism to me even across these last 8 years has been sunk in a kind of a deep pessimism. I disagree with Bill Kay, right? I don't think liberalism in this era has become unpatriotic exactly so much as that it has just become too pessimistic to even get. It's not anti-American, it's just really pessimistic. And Trump has contributed to that, obviously, but there's this cosmic pessimism to liberalism now that's only really been there, in my experience, in the last 10 years or so. And the advantage that the right has is that for all its huckster, mountebank, authoritarian, whatever list of epithets you want to throw, there is also more of that optimism. And that's what you get. That's what people get. It's what young men especially get from watching Musk on Rogan, right? They're not mainlining post-liberal Catholic integralist or 1930s They're not like, oh, that Carl Schmitt, he's got a great point. No, they're like Rogan, Musk, rockets, the American future. That's, if I was giving advice to anti-Trump people, I would say, what is your equivalent of that sort of that vision of dynamism, I guess? That's how America, I think it's going to be the salvation of America. I think America in 50 years we're going to be sitting around and saying, man, the 2020s they were rough, but like, you know, the second half of the 21st century still belong to the United States of America. I have a lot of confidence in that.
How did we lose that metaphysical confidence? Did we have it in the 90s? What went wrong? Was it Iraq? Was it the internet? And how are we going to get it back?
Well, conveniently, my next book. I mean, I think it was a combination of elite failures around war and recession and so on, secularization, and the effects of the internet. And if you want me to be pessimistic, right? When I'm pessimistic, I'm like, the internet is just a machine for inflicting for like human misery and dehumanization, and like AI is going to make it worse. And even though Musk builds things in the real world, he's going to participate in the AIification. I think that's sort of the road to real pessimism, like that the technological future will be anti-human in this profound way. And I think we've lived through some of that, and it's helped to get us where we are right now.
Ross just demonstrated a truth that I've arrived at reluctantly. Norman Mailer once wrote a book called Advertisements for Myself, and I think if authors were strictly honest, every book would have that title.
Yes. I mean, I would say I'm in favor of American optimism and dynamism. A lot of it went with secularism, not with religion. That's a much deeper and longer conversation. But
Completely
I believe
wrong. Just completely
really
wrong.
Moving right along.
Right, Emerson, and also I like Emerson.
Emerson's not secular.
He's not a traditional Orthodox Christian.
Completely agree.
To say nothing of Whitman, to say nothing of all these entrepreneurs in the 20th century. I mean, I don't know. I think one question I would have. This is a longer conversation. Also, is the idea that we can just be comfortable with American religion today. And I say this as someone who's not Christian, so I'm not part of it. But the degree of conspiratorialism and fanaticism there, I have become much more appreciative of Thomas Hobbes in the last 10 years. And I honestly, I mean, everyone, well, you can laugh, but you know what? There was a reason Thomas Hobbes was Thomas Hobbes, and there's a reason that Strauss said he admired Hobbes's humanity. Because what is the alternative? Is the alternative the nice kind of religious constraints? We all have to be more respectful of each other, tradition, or is the alternative Michael Flynn, an insane, just a kind of crazed religiosity or quasi or pseudo-religiosity, to be fair. I don't want to say it's the true authentic religiosity, but it is increasing. It is increasing. Now, maybe that's due to secularization, if you want to have a fancy argument about this is the reaction to all this too much secularization, because God, if only we still had school prayer like we did in 1962, none of this would be happening. I don't believe that either. So I'm much more of a defender of Emerson. Incidentally, all these people everyone's like laughing at, why were they more liberal, more progressive? There's this thing called slavery. I know we're not supposed to talk. I feel I'd be woke if I mentioned it in this audience. There's a reason that people up here in the Northeast were kind of upset about a certain kind of constitutionalism that wasn't serious about constraining slavery. And there's a reason those people became Lincoln Republicans. And that's a very honorable tradition in America. So I think I want to defend a certain kind of American progressivism and secularism, which I think is optimistic. And in fact, was the grounds of most of American optimism for much of the last couple of hundred years, including at the founding, incidentally. At the founding, they were not Washington, Jefferson.
Well, that's why they tolerated.
Franklin. We pretend. No, that's why
that's why they had such a relaxed attitude towards slavery. It took the religious fanaticism of John Brown and Harriet Beecher Stowe, and even Lincoln, a heterodox Christian but a wild providentialist, to actually abolish slavery. You think you get rid of slavery without American Christianity? Please.
Could you have sustained slavery in the South without American Christianity?
Probably not, because American
Christianity was totally on board with it in the South.
The Civil War was a religious conflict over the interpretation of the Bible with religious fanaticism on both sides. Yes,
no,
absolutely.
It wasn't mostly about the Bible, and there wasn't nearly as much religious fanaticism on the northern side, I think, if you look at Lincoln and Grant and all those characters. But, I mean, either way, religion can be misused. You're making my point, actually. We should be much more alert to the misuse. We should be much more alert to the misuse of religion and the use of religion to fanatically justify political causes than people who blithely say, we just need kind of a little more religion here in America are.
Sasha.
I would like to ask about, bring us back to Trump a little bit from this broader question.
We're having a deep theological, political discussion here. You know,
I appreciate it. It's not disconnected from what's been going back and forth. But I feel there's agreement among you all that liberalism needs a certain defense and that there's certain risks. I've appreciated the disagreement, sort of the degree to which Trump is the core of the threat versus other long-term problems. And I guess my question about the upcoming 4 years is, to what extent does a successful Trump presidency aid and sort of defend the effort to bolster liberalism versus threaten it and contribute to sort of a continued decline of liberalism?
It depends
on what the success is. Yeah, go ahead.
We're going to say the same thing. It depends on two things: what he does and how he does it. And and seriously, I mean, if he achieves good results for the country within legal and constitutional bounds, that will strengthen the people's confidence in our institutions, and and it will help to revive a measure of liberal with a small L optimism. My fear is that his promises may achieve the reverse of what he intends and what his supporters hope for. And so, for example, this is a familiar point, his supporters are exercised, as I think we all are to some extent, about the very sharp rise in the level of prices. Mr. Trump appears to believe that massive new tariffs will have no effect whatsoever, and perhaps even a positive effect on the price level. I can't find a lot of economists, however conservative they are, who agree with him on that point. And it worries me. It really does worry me if a leader in whom 51% of the country has reposed all of its hopes either can't do what he said he was going to do, or he does it and it backfires. At that point, I think the sense of things being out of control that I referred to earlier could intensify in very dangerous ways. So I'm not a Democrat who hopes that Trump fails, because the consequences of his failure will not be confined to him and his supporters. It will affect all of us and the rest of the world.
I can just add one word, and I've spoken too much, but look, if one consequence of Trump is that we pull support from Ukraine and Putin either conquers a chunk of it and is ready to conquer the rest at some point and do other things in Europe, or actually does conquer the whole thing, which I don't think is impossible, incidentally, and ends up in Kyiv. And we have 10 million Ukrainian refugees and virtual genocide in Ukraine, and the biggest, obviously the biggest war since 1945, at least in Europe, ends in a victor of a dictator who has invaded a democratic neighbor. Liberalism is not going to recover from that. You cannot have the international order that we have been the basis of. We can lose some wars, and we can mismanage wars, and some things can go very wrong. But here is a case where we are helping a democratic government, a liberal regime, fight back. We've done a pretty good job of helping, an adequate job of helping, and we've gotten a lot of European nations that allegedly were so decadent they couldn't even imagine doing anything to do a lot more. And I had lunch with someone from Prague the other day. There are 500,000 Ukrainians in Czech Republic, which has 10 million people. They're doing fine. They're assimilated. A lot of them are going to stay. Some of them want to go back. Their kids are in school, et cetera. So for all the European decadents, they're doing their part. We're doing our part. And the main thing that's going to happen, we will know this pretty soon. If he's going to, if J.D. Vance has his way, and Tucker Carlson has his way, and probably Elon Musk has his way, and Trump goes along with them and pulls the plug on Ukraine, what will liberalism mean? What will liberalism mean? That we can hang on in here and sort of weather the bad consequences of Trump for another 4 or 8 or 12 years? Is that a world we're going to live in?
Yes, up there.
Changing the subject a little bit. I was hoping you could address the polarization of media and the disinformation, how it affected the election, and then going forward, how it will affect what we experience of the Trump administration.
I mean,
Nobody wants to answer the question.
I mean, I represent the media, so it's a little, you know.
We all do in some.
I mean, I think that I'm not sure. I don't know the answer. I think one of the challenges of this issue is that basically there was a sort of, after 2016, we've sort of had different waves of attitudes towards the internet, right? After Obama's election, during the Arab Spring to some extent, there was an incredibly optimistic liberal narrative about the internet as a foe of tyrants, and that you couldn't, basically the internet and liberalism work together automatically in some way, right? Against authoritarians abroad, but also against conservatives. Let's be honest, at home. And then Trump was elected, with Facebook memes and everything else, and suddenly the mood just completely switched, and you had this period where figuring out what to do about disinformation became a central liberal and progressive preoccupation, culminating in really intense efforts during the COVID era to sort of have activists and public interest groups work with internet companies to try and figure out, what you were not censoring, but sort of, giving, well, there was some overt censorship, but it wasn't governmental, right? It was like, there was sort of an attempt to a really strong attempt to fight disinformation. But that ran into various problems, among them being the inability to decide on what actual disinformation is without, tiptoeing into its own kind of illiberalism, right? And this is where what I said earlier about some people who moved right during that period thinking of themselves as defenders of liberalism, that's where that came from. People who were like, well, the Democrats want the internet companies to censor the lab leak hypothesis about COVID's origins because it's disinformation, but we don't know it's disinformation. It might be true information. There's a good chance it's true. Like what, they want you not to, essentially there was a kind of backlash against a Wild West internet among liberals that led to a backlash among conservatives or former liberals that sort of culminated in Elon Musk getting memed into buying Twitter. And now we're back to liberals looking at that and saying, okay, it's, Musk's control of Twitter that is partially responsible for Trump's reelection and so on. I'm rambling because I don't have an answer to your question. I think there is this sort of pendulum swing back and forth where in certain moments it looks like the internet is like actually radically constrained and controlled, and in some moments it looks like it's like a Wild West dominated by malign actors, and something like TikTok falls somewhere in between, right? Is TikTok communist China disinformation? Is it like, people who, there's like just debates that you can't quite get to the bottom of on this stuff that I expect to shift with new technological shifts. I think generally there are sort of different kinds of disinformation, if you want to call it that left and right are most prone to. There's sort of a respectable groupthink problem in liberalism, and there's a sort of conspiracy theory problem in conservatism that are in way opposite sides of the same coin. You had, anyway, I'm just rambling, but we needed an answer. I don't know the answer, but I don't think the problem can just be distilled to a single identifiable thing called disinformation that we have to figure out how to control. I think it's much weirder and more complex than that.
I agree with Ross about that. I don't have a slam dunk answer either, but I do have a generalization to offer you. And that is that the internet has improved commerce and degraded politics. And the reason it's degraded politics is that it has eliminated gatekeepers. Now, that sounds terribly illiberal. Gatekeepers. Well, they are editors. They're fact checkers. They're people who have some regard for truth as a norm, even if it's not convenient. And, make America great again. I actually think in some ways American media was better when it was more concentrated. If I had to choose between the media landscape of today and the media landscape of the 1960s, I'd choose the 1960s without hesitation. And in that respect, the libertarian vision underlying the internet, I think, is dangerous. And it's dangerous because it allows for the global promulgation of opinions and pseudo-information that used to remain hidden under the rocks of our society. And internet has overturned those rocks, and I don't like what's crawled out from underneath those rocks. And I'm not alone in that sentiment.
One more question, Pat?
We have several more. Susan also has one.
I have 6 minutes. Sorry.
Yes, I agree with you on the 1960s, by the way, on the media bill. My question has to do with a topic which has not been discussed much today, and that is gender. In looking at the newspaper in the last few days, I have seen a lot of references to comments by various high-profile women attributing the loss of Harris to sexism, et cetera. I'm not certain whether that's correct or not, or whether the losses by Clinton and by Harris, which is due to the deficiencies of their candidacies. But let's assume for the moment that they are correct, that there is a significant population, part of the population that will not vote for women. What challenges does that present to the political parties as they're considering candidates for presidency?
Actually, let's have Susan ask her question, then you can address both of them in your final statement.
Okay.
That was pretty much, I was going to also ask the gender question, which has not come up. Does this betoken that women actually do like Trump? What does that mean? Or women like Trump in much greater numbers than was anticipated. This does not seem to be the gender war election that many predicted. So your comments on whatever reflections you have on gender would be appreciated.
Well, here I'll just be empirical.
We have 3 experts on gender
Right.
on this panel, obviously.
So
We do.
among us, then, we clearly represent the universal we. The election of 2024 was much more like the election of 2016 than it was the election of 2020. In 2016, there was a huge gender gap on both sides. And Hillary won strongly among women, and Donald Trump won strongly among men, and the total gap, I think, was in the high 20s or low 30s. I can check that. In 2020, something interesting happened. Joe Biden held on to nearly all of Hillary Clinton's edge among women, but almost fought Trump to a draw among men. It was not a gender war in 2020. And in 2024, we went back to 2016 with the following twist. Kamala Harris was, in her campaign, bet the farm on the proposition that that she could mobilize an army of angry women, and that they would be a higher percentage of the electorate than in 2020, and that she would get a higher percentage of that higher percentage. Both of those assumptions turned out to be wrong. So, to the extent that she had a particularly pointed appeal to women, it didn't work. Trump's appeal to men was much more effective, both in mobilizing especially hard-to-reach young men into the electorate and in improving his share of the male vote. Does that mean that there was a gender war? No. It does mean that for perhaps contingent reasons having to do with the particular circumstances of 2024, both candidates thought that it was in their interests to have a specific kind of gendered appeal. It turned out to be more in the interests of one candidate than the other. That said, this is not a new story. I think it was Chris Matthews decades ago who talked about Democrats and Republicans as the mommy party and the daddy party, right? And so in a way, this is just a continuation of something that's been going on for quite some time. Is it a cause for particular alarm? I don't know. I wish there were less of it, but if there are public policies that hit 1/2 of the human race, or should I say 52% of the human race, harder than the remaining 48% or vice versa, then gender conflict, I think, is inevitable.
I mean, I think I'll, channel my inner liberal feminist and say it's almost certainly the case that sexism is some kind of impediment to female candidates. I think more for the presidency than other offices, maybe for reasons that relate to the discussion of iconography and so on that we were having earlier. I think never having had female president in the U.S., you're looking for politicians who sort of inhabit stereotypes and fulfill particular roles when you're electing a president, I think in a way that's different from when you're electing a legislator. And I think that probably works to the disadvantage of female candidates, that they don't have as many clear sort of types to inhabit, act out, and so on. Mm-hmm. But I also think, to swing rightward, I think the effect is on the margin. Hillary Clinton did, in fact, win the popular vote, could have easily won the presidency, mm-hmm. right? And she was, in many ways, a very polarizing female candidate who many people, really didn't like. So I don't think it's an insurmountable obstacle, but it is a factor. On the larger question, I would say I'm encouraged by the fact that while gender polarization was real in this election, it was not enacted to the degree that a lot of analysts expected, myself somewhat included. The exit polls are provisional, so we'll see. I think that while there is always going to be some divergence between how the sexes vote, reflecting, as Bill says, sort of, differences in how politics affect men and women. I think in current late modern societies, there is a broader polarization of men and women that goes beyond politics, that's manifest in declining rates of dating and sex and relationships and marriage, that's reached very extreme forms in places like South Korea, that is, while less immediately destabilizing than polarization by race and class, is in the long run more dangerous because it threatens the literal continuation of the human race. So I don't take gender polarization in politics lightly at all, and I would like to see it not get worse than it is right now. And there is evidence that it's worst among young voters, who are the people who you want to be uniting. And I think that is a very reasonable thing for societies with low birth rates and a lot of isolation and unhappiness to worry about.
One other thought, Susan, that just struck me, and that is, I wonder whether it's an accident that so many parliamentary systems have found it easier to produce female prime ministers than presidential systems. Is there something special about a presidential system that leans structurally against women? I have no idea what the answer to that question is, but it suddenly struck me that it's a generalization.
Harvey, do you want the last word? Yes.
Harvey has a book about this subject, as I recall.
Yes, but I won't say that. I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank you for coming,
inspiration
and
to
I
us
want to
all.
thank Shep Melnick for presiding over the evening session. Bill Kristol, Bill Galston, Ross Douthat. Thanks for coming, and good to see you all.